Chapter Roman 37, Deeming Sunday the best day for taking Mr. Wemmick's Walworth sentiments. I devoted the next ensuing Sunday afternoon to a pilgrimage to the castle. On arriving before the battlements, I found the Union Jack flying and the drawbridge up, but undeterred by this show of defiance and resistance, I rang at the gate and was admitted in a most pacific manner by the aged. "My son, sir," said the old man, after securing the drawbridge, "rather had it in his mind that you may happen to drop in, and he left word that he would soon be home from his afternoon's walk. He is very regular in his walks, is my son, very regular in everything, is my son." I nodded at the old gentleman as Wemmick himself may have nodded, and we went in and sat down by the fireside. "You made acquaintance with my son, sir," said the old man in his chirping way, while he warmed his hands at the blaze at his office. "I expect." I nodded. "Hall, I have heard that my son is a wonderful hand at his business, sir." I nodded hard. "Yes, so they tell me. His business is the law." I nodded harder, which makes it more surprising in my son, said the old man, for he was not brought up to the law, but to the wine coopering. Curious to know how the old gentleman stood informed concerning the reputation of Mr. Jaggers, I roared that name at him. He threw me into the greatest confusion by laughing heartily and replying in a very sprightly manner, "No, to be sure, you're right." And to this hour I have not the faintest notion what he meant, or what joke he thought I had made. As I could not sit there nodding at him perpetually, without making some other attempt to interest him, I shouted at inquiry whether his own calling in life had been the wine coopering. By dint of straining that term out of myself several times, and tapping the old gentleman on the chest to associate it with him, I at last succeeded in making my meaning understood. "No," said the old gentleman, the warehousing. First, over there." He appeared to mean up the chimney, but I believe he intended to refer me to Liverpool, and then in the city of London here. However, having an infirmity, for I am hard of hearing, sir, I expressed in pantomime the greatest astonishment. "Yes, hard of hearing, having that infirmity coming upon me. My son, he went into the law, and he took charge of me, and he by little and little made out this elegant and beautiful property. But returning to what you said, you know," pursued the old man, again laughing heartily, "what I say is, no, to be sure, you're right." I was modestly wondering whether my utmost ingenuity would have enabled me to say anything that would have amused him half as much as this imaginary pleasantry, when I was startled by a sudden click in the wall on one side of the chimney, and the ghostly tumbling open of a little wooden flap with "John" upon it. The old man, following my eyes, cried, with great triumph, "My son's come home!" and we both went out to the drawbridge. It was worth any money to see Wemmick waving a salute to me from the other side of the moat, when we may have shaken hands across it with the greatest ease. The aged was so delighted to work the drawbridge that I made no offer to assist him, but stood quiet until Wemmick had come across and had presented me to Miss Skiffins, a lady by whom he was accompanied. Miss Skiffins was of a wooden appearance, and was like her escort in the post office branch of the service. She may have been some 2 or 3 years younger than Wemmick, and I judged her to stand possessed of portable property. The cut of her dress from the waist upward, both before and behind, made her figure very like a boy's kite, and I may have pronounced her gown a little too decidedly orange, and her gloves a little too intensely green, but she seemed to be a good sort of fellow, and showed a high regard for the aged. I was not long in discovering that she was a frequent visitor at the castle, for, on our going in, and my complimenting Wemmick on his ingenious contrivance for announcing himself to the aged, he begged me to give my attention for a moment to the other side of the chimney and disappeared. Soon another click came, and another little door tumbled open with Miss Skiffins on it. Then Miss Skiffins shut up and John tumbled open. Then Miss Skiffins and John both tumbled open together and finally shut up together. On Wemmick's return from working these mechanical appliances, I expressed the great admiration with which I regarded them, and he said, "Well, you know, they're both pleasant and useful to the aged. And by George, sir, it's a thing worth mentioning, that of all the people who come to this gate, the secret of those pulls is only known to the aged Miss Skiffins and me, and Mr. Wemmick made them," added Miss Skiffins, "with his own hands, out of his own head." While Miss Skiffins was taking off her bonnet, she retained her green gloves during the evening as an outward and visible sign that there was company. Wemmick invited me to take a walk with him round the property and see how the island looked in winter time, thinking that he did this to give me an opportunity of taking his Walworth sentiments. I seized the opportunity as soon as we were out of the castle. Having thought of the matter with care, I approached my subject as if I had never hinted at it before. I informed Wemmick that I was anxious in behalf of Herbert Pocket, and I told him how we had first met and how we had fought. I glanced at Herbert's home, and at his character, and at his having no means but such as he was dependent on his father for. Those uncertain and unpunctual, I alluded to the advantages I had derived in my first rawness and ignorance from his society, and I confessed that I feared I had but ill repaid them, and that he may have done better without me and my expectations. Keeping Miss Havisham in the background at a great distance, I still hinted at the possibility of my having competed with him in his prospects, and at the certainty of his possessing a generous soul and being far above any mean distrusts, retaliations, or designs. For all these reasons I told Wemmick, and because he was my young companion and friend, and I had a great affection for him, I wished my own good fortune to reflect some rays upon him, and therefore I sought advice from Wemmick's experience and knowledge of men and affairs how I could best try with my resources to help Herbert to some present income, say of 100 a year, to keep him in good hope and heart, and gradually to buy him onto some small partnership. I begged Wemmick, in conclusion, to understand that my help must always be rendered without Herbert's knowledge or suspicion, and that there was no one else in the world with whom I could advise. I wound up by laying my hand upon his shoulder and saying, "I can't help confiding in you, though I know it must be troublesome to you, but that is your fault in having ever brought me here." Wemmick was silent for a little while, and then said with a kind of start, "Well, you know, Mr. Pip, I must tell you one thing. This is devilish good of you. Say you'll help me to be good then," said I. "Ecod," replied Wemmick, shaking his head, "that's not my trade." "Nor is this your trading place," said I. "You are right," he returned. "You hit the nail on the head. Mr. Pip, I'll put on my considering cap, and I think all you want to do may be done by degrees. Skiffins, that's her brother, is an accountant and agent. I'll look him up and go to work for you." "I thank you 10,000 times." "On the contrary," said he, "I thank you, for though we are strictly in our private and personal capacity, still it may be mentioned that there are Newgate cobwebs about, and it brushes them away." After a little further conversation to the same effect, we returned into the castle, where we found Miss Skiffins preparing tea. The responsible duty of making the toast was delegated to the aged, and that excellent old gentleman was so intent upon it that he seemed to me in some danger of melting his eyes. It was no nominal meal that we were going to make, but a vigorous reality. The aged prepared such a haystack of buttered toast that I could scarcely see him over it as it simmered on an iron stand hooked onto the top bar, while Miss Skiffins brewed such a jorum of tea that the pig in the back premises became strongly excited and repeatedly expressed his desire to participate in the entertainment. The flag had been struck and the gun had been fired at the right moment of time, and I felt as snugly cut off from the rest of Walworth as if the moat were 30 feet wide by as many deep. Nothing disturbed the tranquillity of the castle but the occasional tumbling open of John and Miss Skiffins, which little doors were a prey to some spasmodic infirmity that made me sympathetically uncomfortable until I got used to it. I inferred from the methodical nature of Miss Skiffins's arrangements that she made tea there every Sunday night, and I rather suspected that a classic brooch she wore, representing the profile of an undesirable female with a very straight nose and a very new moon, was a piece of portable property that had been given her by Wemmick. We ate the whole of the toast and drank tea in proportion, and it was delightful to see how warm and greasy we all got after it. The aged, especially, may have passed for some clean old chief of a savage tribe, just oiled. After a short pause of repose, Miss Skiffins, in the absence of the little servant who, it seemed, retired to the bosom of her family on Sunday afternoons, washed up the tea things in a trifling, ladylike amateur manner that compromised none of us. Then she put on her gloves again, and we drew round the fire, and Wemmick said, "Now, aged parent, tip us the paper." Wemmick explained to me while the aged got his spectacles out that this was according to custom, and that it gave the old gentleman infinite satisfaction to read the news aloud. "I won't offer an apology," said Wemmick, "for he isn't capable of many pleasures, are you, aged P?" "All right, John, all right," returned the old man, seeing himself spoken to. "Only tip him a nod every now and then when he looks off his paper," said Wemmick, "and he'll be as happy as a king. We are all attention, aged one." "All right, John, all right," returned the cheerful old man, so busy and so pleased that it really was quite charming. The aged's reading reminded me of the classes at Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's, with the pleasanter peculiarity that it seemed to come through a keyhole, as he wanted the candles close to him, and as he was always on the verge of putting either his head or the newspaper into them, he required as much watching as a powder mill. But Wemmick was equally untiring and gentle in his vigilance, and the aged read on, quite unconscious of his many rescues. Whenever he looked at us, we all expressed the greatest interest and amazement, and nodded until he resumed again. As Wemmick and Miss Skiffins sat side by side, and as I sat in a shadowy corner, I observed a slow and gradual elongation of Mr. Wemmick's mouth, powerfully suggestive of his slowly and gradually stealing his arm round Miss Skiffins's waist. In course of time I saw his hand appear on the other side of Miss Skiffins, but at that moment Miss Skiffins neatly stopped him with the green glove, unwound his arm again as if it were an article of dress, and with the greatest deliberation laid it on the table before her. Miss Skiffins's composure while she did this was one of the most remarkable sights I have ever seen, and if I could have thought the act consistent with abstraction of mind, I should have deemed that Miss Skiffins performed it mechanically soon. I noticed Wemmick's arm beginning to disappear again, and gradually fading out of view. Shortly afterwards, his mouth began to widen again, after an interval of suspense on my part that was quite enthralling and almost painful. I saw his hand appear on the other side of Miss Skiffins. Instantly, Miss Skiffins stopped it with the neatness of a placid boxer, took off that girdle or cestus as before, and laid it on the table, taking the table to represent the path of virtue. I am justified in stating that during the whole time of the aged's reading, Wemmick's arm was straying from the path of virtue and being recalled to it by Miss Skiffins. At last, the aged read himself into a light slumber. This was the time for Wemmick to produce a little kettle, a tray of glasses, and a black bottle with a porcelain-topped cork, representing some clerical dignitary of a rubicund and social aspect. With the aid of these appliances we all had something warm to drink, including the aged, who was soon awake again. Miss Skiffins mixed, and I observed that she and Wemmick drank out of one glass. Of course, I knew better than to offer to see Miss Skiffins home, and under the circumstances I thought I had best go first, which I did, taking a cordial leave of the aged, and having passed a pleasant evening. Before a week was out, I received a note from Wemmick, dated Walworth, stating that he hoped he had made some advance in that matter, pertaining to our private and personal capacities, and that he would be glad if I could come and see him again upon it. So I went out to Walworth again, and yet again, and yet again, and I saw him by appointment in the city several times, but never held any communication with him on the subject in or near Little Britain. The upshot was that we found a worthy young merchant or shipping broker, not long established in business, who wanted intelligent help, and who wanted capital, and who in due course of time and receipt would want a partner. Between him and me, secret articles were signed of which Herbert was the subject, and I paid him half of my £500 down, and engaged for sundry other payments, some to fall due at certain dates out of my income, some contingent on my coming into my property. Miss Skiffins's brother conducted the negotiation. Wemmick pervaded it throughout, but never appeared in it. The whole business was so cleverly managed that Herbert had not the least suspicion of my hand being in it. I never shall forget the radiant face with which he came home one afternoon and told me, as a mighty piece of news, of his having fallen in with one Clarriker the young merchant's name, and of Clarriker's having shown an extraordinary inclination towards him, and of his belief that the opening had come at last. Day by day, as his hopes grew stronger and his face brighter, he must have thought me a more and more affectionate friend, for I had the greatest difficulty in restraining my tears of triumph when I saw him so happy. At length, the thing being done, and he having that day entered Clarriker's house, and he having talked to me for a whole evening in a flush of pleasure and success, I did really cry in good earnest when I went to bed, to think that my expectations had done some good to somebody. A great event in my life, the turning point of my life, now opens on my view. But before I proceed to narrate it, and before I pass on to all the changes it involved, I must give one chapter to Estella. Chapter Roman 38. If that staid old house near the green at Richmond should ever come to be haunted when I am dead, it will be haunted, surely, by my ghost. Oh, the many, many nights and days through which the unquiet spirit within me haunted that house when Estella lived there. Let my body beware it. Would my spirit was always wandering, wandering, wandering about that house. The lady with whom Estella was placed, Mrs. Brandley by name, was a widow, with one daughter several years older than Estella. The mother looked young, and the daughter looked old. The mother's complexion was pink, and the daughter's was yellow. The mother set up for frivolity, and the daughter for theology. They were in what is called a good position, and were visited by numbers of people. Little, if any, community of feeling subsisted between them and Estella, but the understanding was established that they were necessary to her, and that she was necessary to them. Mrs. Brandley had been a friend of Miss Havisham's before the time of her seclusion. In Mrs. Brandley's house and out of Mrs. Brandley's house, I suffered every kind and degree of torture that Estella could cause me. The nature of my relations with her, which placed me on terms of familiarity without placing me on terms of favor, conduced to my distraction. She made use of me to tease other admirers, and she turned the very familiarity between herself and me to the account of putting a constant slight on my devotion to her. If I had been her secretary, steward, half-brother, poor relation, if I had been a younger brother of her appointed husband, I could not have seemed to myself further from my hopes when I was nearest to her. The privilege of calling her by her name and hearing her call me by mine became under the circumstances, an aggravation of my trials, and while I think it likely that it almost maddened her other lovers, I know too certainly that it almost maddened me. She had admirers without end. No doubt my jealousy made an admirer of every one who went near her, but there were more than enough of them. Without that, I saw her often at Richmond, I heard of her often in town, and I used often to take her and the Brandleys on the water. There were picnics, FDE days, plays, operas, concerts, parties, all sorts of pleasures, through which I pursued her, and they were all miseries to me. I never had 1 hour's happiness in her society, and yet my mind all round the 24 hours was harping on the happiness of having her with me, unto death, throughout this part of our intercourse, and it lasted, as will soon be seen, for what I then thought a long time. She habitually reverted to that tone which expressed that our association was forced upon us. There were other times when she would come to a sudden check in this tone and in all her many tones, and would seem to pity me. Pip, Pip, she said one evening, coming to such a check, when we sat apart at a darkening window of the house in Richmond, will you never take warning? Of what? Of me. Warning not to be attracted by you? Do you mean, Estella? Do I mean? If you don't know what I mean, you are blind. I should have replied that love was commonly reputed blind, but for the reason that I always was restrained, and this was not the least of my miseries, by a feeling that it was ungenerous to press myself upon her, when she knew that she could not choose but obey Miss Havisham. My dread always was that this knowledge on her part laid me under a heavy disadvantage with her pride, and made me the subject of a rebellious struggle in her bosom. At any rate, said I have no warning given me just now, for you wrote to me to come to you this time. That's true, said Estella, with a cold, careless smile that always chilled me. After looking at the twilight without for a little while, she went on to say, the time has come round when Miss Havisham wishes to have me for a day at Cadiz. You are to take me there and bring me back if you will. She would rather I did not travel alone, and objects to receiving my maid, for she has a sensitive horror of being talked of by such people. Can you take me? Can I take you, Estella? You can then? The day after to tomorrow, if you please. You are to pay all charges out of my purse. You hear the condition of your going, and must obey, said I. This was all the preparation I received for that visit, or for others like it. Miss Havisham never wrote to me, nor had I ever so much as seen her handwriting. We went down on the next day but one, and we found her in the room where I had first beheld her, and it is needless to add that there was no change in Sati's house. She was evening more dreadfully fond of Estella than she had been when I last saw them together. I repeat the word advisedly, for there was something positively dreadful in the energy of her looks and embraces. She hung upon Estella's beauty, hung upon her words, hung upon her gestures, and sat mumbling her own trembling fingers while she looked at her, as though she were devouring the beautiful creature she had reared. From Estella she looked at me with a searching glance that seemed to pry into my heart and probe its wounds. How does she use you, Pip? How does she use you? She asked me again, with her witch-like eagerness, evening in Estella's hearing. But when we sat by her flickering fire at night, she was most weird, for then, keeping Estella's hand drawn through her arm and clutched in her own hand, she extorted from her, by dint of referring back to what Estella had told her in her regular letters, the names and conditions of the men whom she had fascinated. And as Miss Havisham dwelt upon this role with the intensity of a mind mortally hurt and diseased, she sat with her other hand on her crutch stick and her chin on that, and her wan bright eyes glaring at me, a very spectre. I saw in this, wretched though it made me, and bitter the sense of dependence and evening of degradation that it awakened, I saw in this that Estella was set to wreak Miss Havisham's revenge on men, and that she was not to be given to me until she had gratified it for a term. I saw, in this, a reason for her being beforehand assigned to me, sending her out to attract and torment and do mischief. Miss Havisham sent her with the malicious assurance that she was beyond the reach of all admirers, and that all who staked upon that cast were secured to lose. I saw in this that I, too, was tormented by a perversion of ingenuity, evening while the prize was reserved for me. I saw in this the reason for my being staved off so long, and the reason for my late guardian's declining to commit himself to the formal knowledge of such a scheme. In a word, I saw in this Miss Havisham as I had her then and there before my eyes, and always had her before my eyes, and I saw in this the distinct shadow of the darkened and unhealthy house in which her life was hidden from the sun. The candles that lighted that room of hers were placed in sconces on the wall. They were high from the ground, and they burnt with the steady dullness of artificial light in air that is seldom renewed. As I looked round at them, and at the pale gloom they made, and at the stopped clock, and at the withered articles of bridal dress upon the table and the ground, and at her own awful figure with its ghostly reflection, thrown large by the fire upon the ceiling and the wall, I saw in everything the construction that my mind had come to, repeated and thrown back to me. My thoughts passed into the great room across the landing where the table was spread, and I saw it written, as it were, in the falls of the cobwebs from the centerpiece, in the crawlings of the spiders on the cloth, in the tracks of the mice as they betook their little quickened hearts behind the panels, and in the gropings and pausings of the beetles on the floor. It happened on the occasion of this visit that some sharp words arose between Estella and Miss Havisham. It was the first time I had ever seen them opposed. We were seated by the fire, as just now described, and Miss Havisham still had Estella's arm drawn through her own, and still clutched Estella's hand in hers. When Estella gradually began to detach herself, she had shown a proud impatience more than once before, and had rather endured that fierce affection than accepted or returned it. "What," said Miss Havisham, flashing her eyes upon her, "are you tired of me?" "Only a little tired of myself," replied Estella, disengaging her arm, and moving to the great chimney-piece, where she stood looking down at the fire. "Speak the truth, you ingrate," cried Miss Havisham, passionately, striking her stick upon the floor. "You are tired of me." Estella looked at her with perfect composure, and again looked down at the fire. Her graceful figure and her beautiful face expressed a self-possessed indifference to the wild heat of the other that was almost cruel. "You stock and stone," exclaimed Miss Havisham. "You cold, cold heart." "What?" said Estella, preserving her attitude of indifference as she leaned against the great chimney-piece, and only moving her eyes. "Do you reproach me for being cold? Are you not?" was the fierce retort. "You should know," said Estella. "I am what you have made me. Take all the praise, take all the blame, take all the success, take all the failure, in short, take me." "Oh, look at her," cried Miss Havisham, bitterly. "Look at her so hard and thankless on the hearth where she was reared, where I took her into this wretched breast when it was first bleeding from its stabs, and where I have lavished years of tenderness upon her." "At least I was no party to the compact," said Estella, "for if I could walk and speak when it was made, it was as much as I could do. But what would you have? You have been very good to me, and I owe everything to you. What would you have?" "Love," replied the other. "You have it." "I have not," said Miss Havisham. "Mother by adoption," retorted Estella, never departing from the easy grace of her attitude, never raising her voice as the other did, never yielding either to anger or tenderness. "Mother by adoption, I have said that I owe everything to you. All I possess is freely yours. All that you have given me is at your command to have again. Beyond that, I have nothing. And if you ask me to give you what you never gave me, my gratitude and duty cannot do impossibilities." "Did I never give her love?" cried Miss Havisham, turning wildly to me. Did I never give her a burning love, inseparable from jealousy at all times and from sharp pain? While she speaks thus to me, let her call me mad, let her call me mad. Why should I call you mad? Returned Estella. I, of all people. Does any one live, who knows what set purposes you have, half as well as I do? Does any one live, who knows what a steady memory you have, half as well as I do? I who have sat on this same hearth on the little stool that is evening now beside you there, learning your lessons and looking up into your face, when your face was strange and frightened me, soon forgotten, moaned Miss Havisham. Times soon forgotten. No, not forgotten, retorted Estella, not forgotten, but treasured up in my memory. When have you found me false to your teaching? When have you found me unmindful of your lessons? When have you found me giving admission here? She touched her bosom with her hand to anything that you excluded. Be just to me. So proud, moaned Miss Havisham, pushing away her gray hair with both her hands. Who taught me to be proud? Returned Estella. Who praised me when I learnt my lesson? So hard, moaned Miss Havisham with her former action. Who taught me to be hard? Returned Estella. Who praised me when I learnt my lesson? But to be proud and hard to me, Miss Havisham quite shrieked as she stretched out her arms. Estella, 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 to be proud and hard to me. Estella looked at her for a moment with a kind of calm wonder, but was not otherwise disturbed. When the moment was past, she looked down at the fire again. I cannot think, said Estella, raising her eyes after a silence, why you should be so unreasonable when I come to see you after a separation. I have never forgotten your wrongs and their causes. I have never been unfaithful to you or your schooling. I have never shown any weakness that I can charge myself with. Would it be weakness to return my love? Exclaimed Miss Havisham. But, yes, she would call it so. I begin to think, said Estella, in a musing way, after another moment of calm wonder, that I almost understand how this comes about. If you had brought up your adopted daughter wholly in the dark confinement of these rooms, and had never let her know that there was such a thing as the daylight by which she had never once seen your face, if you had done that, and then, for a purpose, had wanted her to understand the daylight and know all about it, you would have been disappointed and angry. Miss Havisham, with her head in her hands, sat making a low moaning and swaying herself on her chair, but gave no answer. Or, said Estella, which is in your case, if you had taught her, from the dawn of her intelligence, with your utmost energy and may, that there was such a thing as daylight, but that it was made to be her enemy and destroyer, and she must always turn against it, for it had blighted you and would else blight her. If you had done this, and then, for a purpose, had wanted her to take naturally to the daylight, and she could not do it, you would have been disappointed and angry. Miss Havisham sat listening, or it seemed so, for I could not see her face, but still made no answer. So, said Estella, I must be taken as I have been made. The success is not mine, the failure is not mine, but the two together make me. Miss Havisham had settled down, I hardly knew how, upon the floor, among the faded bridal relics with which it was strewn. I took advantage of the moment. I had sought one from the first to leave the room, after beseeching Estella's attention to her, with a movement of my hand. When I left, Estella was yet standing by the great chimney-piece, just as she had stood throughout. Miss Havisham's gray hair was all adrift upon the ground among the other bridal wrecks, and was a miserable sight to see. It was with a depressed heart that I walked in the starlight for an hour and more, about the courtyard, and about the brewery, and about the ruined garden. When I at last took courage to return to the room, I found Estella sitting at Miss Havisham's knee, taking up some stitches in one of those old articles of dress that were dropping to pieces, and of which I have often been reminded since by the faded tatters of old banners that I have seen hanging up in cathedrals. Afterwards, Estella and I played at cards as of yore, only we were skillful now and played French games, and so the evening wore away and I went to bed. I lay in that separate building across the courtyard. It was the first time I had ever lain down to rest in Sati's house, and sleep refused to come near me. 1,000 Miss Havishams haunted me. She was on this side of my pillow, on that, at the head of the bed, at the foot, behind the half-open door of the dressing room, in the dressing room, in the room, overhead, in the room beneath, everywhere. At last, when the night was slow to creep on towards 2 o'clock, I felt that I absolutely could no longer bear the place as a place to lie down in, and that I must get up. I therefore got up and put on my clothes, and went out across the yard, into the long stone passage, designing to gain the outer courtyard and walk there for the relief of my mind. But I was no sooner in the passage than I extinguished my candle, for I saw Miss Havisham going along it, in a ghostly manner, making a low cry. I followed her at a distance, and saw her go up the staircase. She carried a bare candle in her hand, which she had probably taken from one of the sconces in her own room, and was a most unearthly object by its light. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, I felt the mildewed air of the feast chamber without, seeing her open the door, and I heard her walking there, and so across, into her own room, and so across again into that, never ceasing the low cry. After a time, I tried in the dark both to get out and to go back, but I could do neither until some streaks of day strayed in and showed me where to lay my hands. During the whole interval, whenever I went to the bottom of the staircase, I heard her footstep, saw her light pass above, and heard her ceaseless low cry. Before we left next day, there was no revival of the difference between her and Estella, nor was it ever revived on any similar occasion, and there were 4 similar occasions, to the best of my remembrance, nor did Miss Havisham's manner towards Estella in anywise change, except that I believed it to have something like fear infused among its former characteristics. It is impossible to turn this leaf of my life without putting Bentley Drummle's name upon it, or I would, very gladly, on a certain occasion when the Finches were assembled in force, and when good feeling was being promoted in the usual manner by nobody's agreeing with anybody else, the presiding Finch called the Grove to order, forasmuch as Mr. Drummle had not yet toasted a lady, which, according to the solemn constitution of the society, it was the brute's turn to do that day. I thought I saw him leer in an ugly way at me while the decanters were going round, but as there was no love lost between us, that may easily be. What was my indignant surprise when he called upon the company to pledge him to Estella. Estella who? Said I. Never you mind, retorted Drummle. Estella of where? Said I. You are bound to say of where, which he was as a Finch. Of Richmond, gentlemen, said Drummle, putting me out of the question, and a peerless beauty. Much he knew about peerless beauties, a mean, miserable idiot. I, whispered Herbert. I know that lady, said Herbert, across the table, when the toast had been honored. Do you? Said Drummle. And so do I added, with a scarlet face. Do you? Said Drummle. Oh, Lord! This was the only retort, except glass or crockery, that the heavy creature was capable of making, but I became as highly incensed by it as if it had been barbed with wit, and I immediately rose in my place, and said that I could not but regard it as being like the Honourable Finch's impudence to come down to that grove. We always talked about coming down to that grove as a neat parliamentary turn of expression, down to that grove, proposing a lady of whom he knew nothing. Mr. Drummle, upon this, starting up, demanded what I meant by that, upon which I made him the extreme reply that I believed he knew where I was to be found, whether it was possible in a Christian country to get on without blood. After this was a question on which the Finches were divided. The debate upon it grew so lively, truly, that at least 6 more honorable members told 6 more during the discussion. that they believed they knew where they were to be found. However, it was decided at last, the Grove being a court of honor, that if Mr. Drummle would bring never so slight a certificate from the lady, importing that he had the honor of her acquaintance, Mr. Pip must express his regret as a gentleman and a Finch for having been betrayed into a warmth which next day was appointed for the production, lest our honor should take cold from delay, and next day Drummle appeared with a polite little avowal in Estella's hand that she had had the honor of dancing with him several times. This left me no course but to regret that I had been betrayed into a warmth which, and on the whole to repudiate as untenable the idea that I was to be found anywhere. Drummle and I then sat snorting at one another for an hour, while the Grove engaged in indiscriminate contradiction, and finally the promotion of good feeling was declared to have gone ahead at an amazing rate. I tell this lightly, but it was no light thing to me, for I cannot adequately express what pain it gave me to think that Estella should show any favor to a contemptible, clumsy, sulky booby so very far below the average. To the present moment, I believe it to have been referable to some pure fire of generosity and disinterestedness in my love for her, that I could not endure the thought of her stooping to that hound. No doubt I should have been miserable whomsoever she had favored, but a worthier object would have caused me a different kind and degree of distress. It was easy for me to find out, and I did soon find out, that Drummle had begun to follow her closely, and that she allowed him to do it a little while, and he was always in pursuit of her, and he and I crossed one another every day. He held on in a dull persistent way, and Estella held him on, now with encouragement, now with discouragement, now almost flattering him, now openly despising him, now knowing him very well, now scarcely remembering who he was. The spider, as Mr. Jaggers had called him, was used to lying in wait, however, and had the patience of his tribe. Added to that, he had a blockhead confidence in his money and in his family greatness, which sometimes did him good service, almost taking the place of concentration and determined purpose. So, the spider, doggedly watching Estella, outwatched many brighter insects, and would often uncoil himself and drop at the right nick of time. At a certain assembly ball at Richmond there used to be assembly balls at most places then, where Estella had outshone all other beauties. This blundering Drummle so hung about her, and with so much toleration on her part, that I resolved to speak to her concerning him. I took the next opportunity, which was when she was waiting for Mrs. Blandly to take her home, and was sitting apart among some flowers, ready to go. I was with her, for I almost always accompanied them to and from such places. Are you tired, Estella? Rather, Pip. You should be. Say rather. I should not be, for I have my letter to Sati's house to write before I go to sleep, recounting tonight's triumph. Said I, surely a very poor one, Estella. What do you mean? I didn't know there had been any. Estella, said I, do look at that fellow in the corner over there who is looking over here at us. Why should I look at him? Returned Estella, with her eyes on me. Instead, what is there in that fellow in the corner over there, to use your words, that I need look at? Truly, that is the very question I want to ask you, said I. For he has been hovering about you all night. Moths and all sorts of ugly creatures, replied Estella, with a glance towards him, hover about a lighted candle. Can the candle help it? No, I returned. But cannot the Estella help it? Well, said she, laughing, after a moment, perhaps. Yes, anything you like. But, Estella, do hear me speak. It makes me wretched that you should encourage a man so generally despised as Drummle. You know he is despised. Well, said she, you know he is as ungainly within as without, a deficient, ill-tempered, lowering, stupid fellow. Well, said she, You know he has nothing to recommend him but money and a ridiculous roll of addle-headed predecessors, now, don't you? Well, said she again, and each time she said it, she opened her lovely eyes the wider. To overcome the difficulty of getting past that monosyllable, I took it from her and said, repeating it with emphasis, well, then, that is why it makes me wretched. Now, if I could have believed that she favored Drummle with any idea of making me wretched, I should have been in better heart about it. But in that habitual way of hers, she put me so entirely out of the question that I could believe nothing of the kind. Pip, said Estella, casting her glance over the room, don't be foolish about its effect on you. It may have its effect on others and may be meant to have. It's not worth discussing. Yes, it is, said I, because I cannot bear that people should say she throws away her graces and attractions on a mere bore, the lowest in the crowd. I can bear it, said Estella, though. Don't be so proud, Estella, and so inflexible. Calls me proud and inflexible in this breath, said Estella, opening her hands, and in his last breath reproached me for stooping to a bore. There is no doubt you do, said I, something hurriedly, for I have seen you give him looks and smiles this very night, such as you never give to me. Do you want me then, said Estella, turning suddenly with a fixed and serious, if not angry, look, to deceive and entrap you? Do you deceive and entrap him, Estella? Yes, and many others, all of them but you. Here is Mrs. Brandley. I'll say no more. Asterisk, asterisk. And now that I have given the one chapter to the theme that so filled my heart, and so often made it ache and ache again, I pass on unhindered to the event that had impended over me longer yet, the event that had begun to be prepared for, before I knew that the world held Estella, and in the days when her baby intelligence was receiving its first distortions from Miss Havisham's wasting hands. In the Eastern story, the heavy slab that was to fall on the bed of state in the flush of conquest was slowly wrought out of the quarry. The tunnel for the rope to hold it in its place was slowly carried through the leagues of rock. The slab was slowly raised and fitted in the roof. The rope was rove to it and slowly taken through the miles of hollow to the great iron ring, all being made ready with much labor, and the hour come, the Sultan was aroused in the dead of the night, and the sharpened axe that was to sever the rope from the great iron ring was put into his hand, and he struck with it, and the rope parted and rushed away, and the ceiling fell. Chapter Roman 39. I was 23 years of age. Not another word had I heard to enlighten me on the subject of my expectations, and my 23rd birthday was a week gone. We had left Barnard's Inn more than a year, and lived in the Temple. Our chambers were in Garden Court, down by the river. Mr. Pocket and I had for some time parted company as to our original relations, though we continued on the best terms. Notwithstanding my inability to settle to anything, which I hope arose out of the restless and incomplete tenure on which I held my means, I had a taste for reading, and read regularly so many hours a day. That matter of Herbert's was still progressing, and everything with me was as I have brought it down to the close of the last preceding chapter. Business had taken Herbert on a journey to Marseille. I was alone, and had a dull sense of being alone, dispirited and anxious, long hoping that tomorrow or next week would clear my way, and long disappointed. I sadly missed the cheerful face and ready response of my friend. It was wretched weather, stormy and wet, and mud, 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 deep in all the streets. Day after day, a vast heavy veil had been driving over London from the east, and it drove still, as if in the east there were an eternity of cloud and wind. So furious had been the gusts, that high buildings in town had had the leads stripped off their roofs, and in the country, trees had been torn up, and sails of windmills carried away, and gloomy accounts had come in from the coast of shipwreck and death. Violent blasts of rain had accompanied these rages of wind, and the day just closed as I sat down to read had been the worst of all. Alterations have been made in that part of the temple since that time, and it has not now so lonely a character as it had been, nor is it so exposed to the river. We lived at the top of the last house, and the wind rushing up the river shook the house that night, like discharges of cannon or breakings of a sea. When the rain came with it and dashed against the windows, I thought, raising my eyes to them as they rocked, that I may have fancied myself in a storm-beaten lighthouse. Occasionally, the smoke came rolling down the chimney as though it could not bear to go out into such a night, and when I set the doors open and looked down the staircase lamps were blown out, and when I shaded my face with my hands and looked through the black windows, opening them ever so little was out of the question in the tests of such wind and rain. I saw that the lamps in the court were blown out, and that the lamps on the bridges and the shore were shuddering, and that the coal fires in barges on the river were being carried away before the wind like red-hot splashes in the rain. I read with my watch upon the table, purposing to close my book at 11 o'clock. As I shut it, St. Paul's and all the many church clocks in the city, some leading, some accompanying, some following, struck that hour. The sound was curiously flawed by the wind, and I was listening and thinking how the wind assailed and tore it, when I heard a footstep on the stair. What nervous folly made me start, and awfully connect it with the footstep of my dead sister, matters not. It was past in a moment, and I listened again, and heard the footstep stumble in coming on. Remembering then that the staircase lights were blown out, I took up my reading lamp and went out to the stairhead. Whoever was below had stopped on seeing my lamp, for all was quiet. "There is someone down there, is there not?" I called out, looking down. "Yes," said a voice from the darkness beneath. "What floor do you want?" "The top." "Mr. Pip, that is my name." "There is nothing the matter?" "Nothing the matter," returned the voice. And the man came on. I stood with my lamp held out over the stair rail, and he came slowly within its light. It was a shaded lamp to shine upon a book, and its circle of light was very contracted, so that he was in it for a mere instant, and then out of it. In the instant, I had seen a face that was strange to me, looking up with an incomprehensible air of being touched and pleased by the sight of me. Moving the lamp as the man moved, I made out that he was substantially dressed, but roughly, like a voyager by sea, that he had long iron gray hair, that his age was about 60, that he was a muscular man, strong on his legs, and that he was browned and hardened by exposure to weather. As he ascended the last stair or two, and the light of my lamp included us both, I saw, with a stupid kind of amazement, that he was holding out both his hands to me. "Pray, what is your business?" I asked him. "My business," he repeated, pausing. "Ah, yes, I will explain my business by your leave. Do you wish to come in?" "Yes," he replied, "I wish to come in, master." I had asked him the question inhospitably enough, for I resented the sort of bright and gratified recognition that still shone in his face. I resented it because it seemed to imply that he expected me to respond to it. But I took him into the room I had just left, and having set the lamp on the table, asked him as civilly as I could to explain himself. He looked about him with the strangest air, an air of wondering pleasure, as if he had some part in the things he admired, and he pulled off a rough outer coat and his hat. Then I saw that his head was furrowed and bald, and that the long iron gray hair grew only on its sides, but I saw nothing that in the least explained him. On the contrary, I saw him next moment once more holding out both his hands to me. "What do you mean?" said I, half suspecting him to be mad. He stopped in his looking at me, and slowly rubbed his right hand over his head. It's disappointing to a man, he said, in a coarse, broken voice, arter having looked for'ard so distant and come so fur. But you're not to blame for that, neither on us is to blame for that. They'll speak in half a minute. Give me half a minute, please. He sat down on a chair that stood before the fire and covered his forehead with his large brown veinous hands. I looked at him attentively, then, and recoiled a little from him, but I did not know him. There's no one near, said he, looking over his shoulder. Is there? Why do you, a stranger coming into my rooms at this time of the night, ask that question? Said I. You're a game one, he returned, shaking his head at me with a deliberate affection, at once most unintelligible and most exasperating. I'm glad you've growed up, a game one, but don't catch hold of me. You'd be sorry arterwards to have done it. I relinquished the intention he had detected, for I knew him. Evening yet, I could not recall a single feature, but I knew him. If the wind and the rain had driven away the intervening years, had scattered all the intervening objects, had swept us to the churchyard where we first stood, face to face on such different levels, I could not have known my convict more distinctly than I knew him now as he sat in the chair before the fire. No need to take a file from his pocket and show it to me. No need to take the handkerchief from his neck and twist it round his head. No need to hug himself with both his arms and take a shivering turn across the room, looking back at me for recognition. I knew him before he gave me one of those aids, though a moment before I had not been conscious of remotely suspecting his identity. He came back to where I stood and again held out both his hands, not knowing what to do. For, in my astonishment, I had lost my self-possession. I reluctantly gave him my hands. He grasped them heartily, raised them to his lips, kissed them, and still held them. You acted noble, my boy, said he. Noble, Pip, and I have never forgot it. At a change in his manner, as if he were even going to embrace me, I laid a hand upon his breast and put him away. Stay, said I. Keep off. If you are grateful to me for what I did when I was a little child, I hope you have shown your gratitude by mending your way of life. If you have come here to thank me, it was not necessary. Still, however you have found me out, there must be something good in the feeling that has brought you here, and I will not repulse you. But surely you must understand that my attention was so attracted by the singularity of his fixed look at me that the words died away on my tongue. You was saying, he observed, when we had confronted one another in silence, that surely I must understand. What, surely must I understand? That I cannot wish to renew that chance intercourse with you of long ago, under these different circumstances. I am glad to believe you have repented and recovered yourself. I am glad to tell you so. I am glad that, thinking I deserve to be thanked, you have come to thank me. But our ways are different ways, none the less. You are wet, and you look weary. Will you drink something before you go? He had replaced his neckerchief loosely, and had stood, keenly observant of me, biting a long end of it. I think, he answered, still with the end at his mouth and still observant of me, that I will drink. I thank you afore I go. There was a tray ready on a side table. I brought it to the table near the fire and asked him what he would have. He touched one of the bottles without looking at it or speaking, and I made him some hot rum and water. I tried to keep my hand steady while I did so, but his look at me as he leaned back in his chair with the long draggled end of his neckerchief between his teeth, evidently forgotten, made my hand very difficult to master. When at last I put the glass to him, I saw with amazement that his eyes were full of tears. Up to this time I had remained standing, not to disguise that I wished him gone, but I was softened by the softened aspect of the man, and felt a touch of reproach. I hope, said I, hurriedly putting something into a glass for myself and drawing a chair to the table, that you will not think I spoke harshly to you just now. I had no intention of doing it, and I am sorry for it if I did. I wish you well and happy. As I put my glass to my lips, he glanced with surprise at the end of his neckerchief dropping from his mouth when he opened it, and stretched out his hand. I gave him mine, and then he drank, and drew his sleeve across his eyes and forehead. How are you living? I asked him. I've been a sheep farmer, stock reader, other trades besides, away in the New World, said he, many 1,000 miles of stormy water off from this. I hope you have done well. I've done wonderfully well. There's others went out a longer me as has done well too, but no man has done near as well as me. I'm famous for it. I am glad to hear it. I hope to hear you say so, my dear boy. Without stopping to try to understand those words or the tone in which they were spoken, I turned off to a point that had just come into my mind. Have you ever seen a messenger you once sent to me? I inquired, since he undertook that trust. Never set eyes upon him. I warn't likely to it. He came faithfully, and he brought me the 2 1-pound notes. I was a poor boy then, as you know, and to a poor boy they were a little fortune. But, like you, I have done well since, and you must let me pay them back. You can put them to some other poor boy's use. I took out my purse. He watched me as I laid my purse upon the table and opened it, and he watched me as I separated 2 1-pound notes from its contents. They were clean and new, and I spread them out and handed them over to him. Still watching me, he laid them one upon the other, folded them longwise, gave them a twist, set fire to them at the lamp, and dropped the ashes into the tray. May I make so bold, he said then, with a smile that was like a frown, and with a frown that was like a smile, as ask you how you have done. Well, since you and me was out on them lone shivering marshes, how? Ah! He emptied his glass, got up, and stood at the side of the fire, with his heavy brown hand on the mantel shelf. He put a foot up to the bars, to dry and warm it, and the wet boot began to steam. But he neither looked at it, nor at the fire, but steadily looked at me. It was only now that I began to tremble, when my lips had parted, and had shaped some words that were without sound. I forced myself to tell him, though I could not do it distinctly, that I had been chosen to succeed to some property. May a mere warrant ask what property? Said he. I faltered. I don't know. May a mere warrant ask whose property? Said he. I faltered again. I don't know. Could I make a guess? I wonder, said the convict, at your income, since you come of age. As to the first figure now, 5. With my heart beating like a heavy hammer of disordered action, I rose out of my chair and stood with my hand upon the back of it, looking wildly at him. Concerning a guardian, he went on, there ought to have been some guardian or such like, whiles you was a minor, some lawyer, maybe. As to the first letter of that lawyer's name now, would it be J? All the truth of my position came flashing on me, and its disappointments, dangers, disgraces, consequences of all kinds rushed in such a multitude that I was borne down by them and had to struggle for every breath I drew. Put it, he resumed, as the employer of that lawyer whose name begun with a J and may be Jaggers. Put it as he had come over sea to Portsmouth, and had landed there, and had wanted to come on to you. However, you have found me out, you says just now. Well, however, did I find you out? Why, I wrote from Portsmouth to a person in London for particulars of your address. That person's name? Why, Wemmick. I could not have spoken one word, though it had been to save my life. I stood, with a hand on the chair back and a hand on my breast, where I seemed to be suffocating. I stood so, looking wildly at him, until I grasped at the chair, when the room began to surge and turn. He caught me, drew me to the sofa, put me up against the cushions, and bent on one knee before me. bringing the face that I now well remembered and that I shuddered at, very near to mine. Yes, Pip, dear boy, I've made a gentleman on you. It's me what has done it. I swore that time, sure as ever I earned a guinea, that guinea should go to you. I swore arterwards, sure as ever I speculated and got rich, you should get rich. I lived rough, that you should live smooth. I worked hard, that you should be above work. What odds, dear boy, do I tell it for you to feel a obligation? Not a bit. I tell it for you to know as that there hunted dunghill dog what you kept life in, got his head so high that he could make a gentleman, and Pip, you're him. The abhorrence in which I held the man, the dread I had of him, the repugnance with which I shrank from him, could not have been exceeded if he had been some terrible beast. Look'ee here, Pip, I'm your second father. You're my son more to me nor any son. I've put away money only for you to spend. When I was a hired out shepherd in a solitary hut, not seeing no faces but faces of sheep till I half forgot what men's and women's faces was like. I see. Yorn, I drops my knife many a time in that hut when I was eating my dinner or my supper, and I says, here's the boy again, a-looking at me whiles I eats and drinks. I see you there a many times, as plain as ever I see you on them misty marshes. Lord strike me dead, I says each time, and I goes out in the air to say it under the open heavens, but what if I gets liberty and money, I'll make that boy a gentleman. And I done it. Why, look at you, dear boy, look at these here lodgings, though your'n fit for a lord. A lord? Ah, you shall show money with lords for wagers and beat in his heat and triumph, and in his knowledge that I had been nearly fainting, he did not remark on my reception of all this. It was the one grain of relief I had. Look'ee here, he went on, taking my watch out of my pocket, and turning towards him a ring on my finger, while I recoiled from his touch as if he had been a snake, a gold un and a beauty. That's a gentleman's, I hope. A diamond all set round with rubies, that's a gentleman's, I hope. Look at your linen, fine and beautiful. Look at your clothes, better ain't to be got. And your books too, turning his eyes round the room, mounting up on their shelves by hundreds. And you read, don't you? I see you'd been a reading of when I come in. Ha, ha, ha. You shall read to me, dear boy. And if they're in foreign languages what I don't understand, I shall be just as proud as if I did. Again he took both my hands and put them to his lips, while my blood ran cold within me. Don't you mind talking, Pip, said he, after again drawing his sleeve over his eyes and forehead, as the click came in his throat, which I well remembered, and he was all the more horrible to me that he was so much in earnest. You can't do better nor keep quiet, dear boy. You ain't looked slowly forward to this as I have. You wasn't prepared for this as I was. But didn't you never think it may be me? Oh no, 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 I returned, never, never. Well, you see it was me, and single-handed. Never a soul in it but my own self and Mr. Jaggers. Was there no one else? I asked. No, said he, with a glance of surprise. Who else should there be? And, dear boy, how good-looking you have growed. There's bright eyes somewheres, eh? Isn't there bright eyes somewheres, what you love the thoughts on? Oh, Estella, Estella, they shall be yourn, dear boy, if money can buy not that a gentleman like you, so well set up as you, can't win off of his own game, but money shall back you. Let me finish what I was a-telling you, dear boy. From that there hut and that there hiring out, I got money, left me by my master which died and had been the same as me, and got my liberty and went for myself. In every single thing I went for you. Lord strike a blight upon it, I says, woter it was I went, for if it ain't for him, it all prospered wonderful. As I give you to understand just now, I'm famous for it. It was the money left me, and the gains of the first few year what I sent home to Mr. Jaggers, all for you, when he first come arter you, agreeable to my letter. Oh, that he had never come, that he had left me at the forge, far from contented, yet, by comparison happy, and then, dear boy, it was a recompense to me, look ye here, to know in secret that I was making a gentleman. The blood horses of them colonists may fling up the dust over me as I was walking. What do I say? I says to myself, I'm making a better gentleman nor ever you'll be. When one of 'em says to another, he was a convict a few year ago, and is a ignorant common fellow now, for all he's lucky. What do I say? I says to myself, if I ain't a gentleman, nor yet ain't got no learning, I'm the owner of such. All on you owns stock and land, which on you owns a brought up London gentleman. This way I kept myself a-going, and this way I held steady afore my mind that I would for certain come one day, and see my boy, and make myself known to him, on his own ground. He laid his hand on my shoulder. I shuddered at the thought that for anything I knew, his hand may be stained with blood. It warn't easy, Pip, for me to leave them parts, nor yet it warn't safe, but I held to it, and the harder it was, the stronger I held, for I was determined and my mind firm made up. At last I done it. Dear boy, I done it. I tried to collect my thoughts, but I was stunned. Throughout, I had seemed to myself to attend more to the wind and the rain than to him. Evening now, I could not separate his voice from those voices, though those were loud and his was silent. Where will you put me? He asked. Soon, I must be put somewheres, dear boy. To sleep, said I. Yes, and to sleep long and sound, he answered, for I've been sea-tossed and sea-washed months and months. My friend and companion, said I, rising from the sofa, is absent. You must have his room. He won't come back to tomorrow, will he? No, said I, answering almost mechanically, in spite of my utmost efforts, not to tomorrow, because, look ye here, dear boy, he said, dropping his voice, and laying a long finger on my breast in an impressive manner, caution is necessary. How do you mean, caution? By G, it's death. What's death? I was sent for life. It's death to come back. There's been overmuch coming back of late years, and I should of a certainty be hanged if took. Nothing was needed but this. The wretched man, after loading wretched me with his gold and silver chains for years, had risked his life to come to me, and I held it there in my keeping. If I had loved him instead of abhorring him, if I had been attracted to him by the strongest admiration and affection, instead of shrinking from him with the strongest repugnance, it could have been no worse. On the contrary, it would have been better, for his preservation would then have naturally and tenderly addressed my heart. My first care was to close the shutters, so that no light may be seen from without, and then to close and make fast the doors. While I did so, he stood at the table drinking rum and eating biscuit, and when I saw him thus engaged, I saw my convict on the marshes at his meal again. It almost seemed to me as if he must stoop down soon to file at his leg. When I had gone into Herbert's room, and had shut off any other communication between it and the staircase than through the room in which our conversation had been held, I asked him if he would go to bed. He said yes, but asked me for some of my gentleman's linen to put on in the morning. I brought it out and laid it ready for him, and my blood again ran cold when he again took me by both hands to give me good might. I got away from him, without knowing how I did it, and mended the fire in the room where we had been together, and sat down by it, afraid to go to bed. For an hour or more, I remained too stunned to think, and it was not until I began to think that I began fully to know how wrecked I was, and how the ship in which I had sailed was gone to pieces. Miss Havisham's intentions towards me, all a mere dream, Estella not designed for me. I only suffered in Sati's house as a convenience, a sting for the greedy relations, a model with a mechanical heart to practice on when no other practice was at hand. Those were the first smarts I had. But sharpest and deepest pain of all, it was for the convict, guilty of I knew not what crimes, and liable to be taken out of those rooms where I sat thinking, and hanged at the Old Bailey door, that I had deserted Joe. I would not have gone back to Joe now. I would not have gone back to Biddy now for any consideration, simply, I suppose, because my sense of my own worthless conduct to them was greater than every consideration. No wisdom on earth could have given me the comfort that I should have derived from their simplicity and fidelity, but I could never, never undo what I had done. In every rage of wind and rush of rain, I heard pursuers. Twice I could have sworn there was a knocking and whispering at the outer door. With these fears upon me, I began either to imagine or recall that I had had mysterious warnings of this man's approach, that, for weeks gone by, I had passed faces in the streets which I had thought like his, that these likenesses had grown more numerous as he, coming over the sea, had drawn near, that his wicked spirit had somehow sent these messengers to mine, and that now on this stormy night he was as good as his word, and with me. Crowding up with these reflections came the reflection that I had seen him with my childish eyes to be a desperately violent man, that I had heard that other convict reiterate that he had tried to murder him, that I had seen him down in the ditch tearing and fighting like a wild beast. Out of such remembrances I brought into the light of the fire a half-formed terror that it may not be safe to be shut up there with him in the dead of the wild solitary night. This dilated until it filled the room and impelled me to take a candle and go in and look at my dreadful burden. He had rolled a handkerchief round his head, and his face was set and lowering in his sleep, but he was asleep, and quietly too, though he had a pistol lying on the pillow. Assured of this, I softly removed the key to the outside of his door and turned it on him before I again sat down by the fire. Gradually I slipped from the chair and lay on the floor. When I awoke without having parted in my sleep with the perception of my wretchedness, the clocks of the eastward churches were striking 5, the candles were wasted out, the fire was dead, and the wind and rain intensified the thick black darkness. Chapter 40. It was fortunate for me that I had to take precautions to ensure so far as I could the safety of my dreaded visitor, for this thought pressing on me when I awoke held other thoughts in a confused concourse at a distance. The impossibility of keeping him concealed in the chambers was self-evident. It could not be done, and the attempt to do it would inevitably engender suspicion. True, I had no avenger in my service now, but I was looked after by an inflammatory old female, assisted by an animated ratbag whom she called her niece, and to keep a room secret from them would be to invite curiosity and exaggeration. They both had weak eyes, which I had long attributed to their chronically looking in at keyholes, and they were always at hand when not wanted. Truly that was their only reliable quality besides larceny. Not to get up a mystery with these people, I resolved to announce in the morning that my uncle had unexpectedly come from the country. This course I decided on while I was yet groping about in the darkness for the means of getting a light. Not stumbling on the means after all, I was fain to go out to the adjacent lodge and get the watchman there to come with his lantern. Now, in groping my way down the black staircase, I fell over something, and that something was a man crouching in a corner. As the man made no answer when I asked him what he did there, but eluded my touch in silence, I ran to the lodge and urged the watchman to come quickly, telling him of the incident on the way back. The wind being as fierce as ever, we did not care to endanger the light in the lantern by rekindling the extinguished lamps on the staircase. but we examined the staircase from the bottom to the top and found no one there. It then occurred to me as possible that the man may have slipped into my rooms, so, lighting my candle at the watchman's and leaving him standing at the door, I examined them carefully, including the room in which my dreaded guest lay asleep. All was quiet, and assuredly no other man was in those chambers. It troubled me that there should have been a lurker on the stairs on that night of all nights in the year, and I asked the watchman, on the chance of eliciting some hopeful explanation, as I handed him a dram at the door, whether he had admitted at his gate any gentleman who had perceptibly been dining out. Yes, he said, at different times of the night, 3. One lived in Fountain Court, and the other 2 lived in the lane, and he had seen them all go home. Again, the only other man who dwelt in the house of which my chambers formed a part had been in the country for some weeks, and he certainly had not returned in the night, because we had seen his door with his seal on it as we came upstairs. The night being so bad, sir, said the watchman as he gave me back my glass, uncommon few have come in at my gate. Besides them 3 gentlemen that I have named, I don't call to mind another since about 11 o'clock, when a stranger asked for you. My uncle, I muttered. Yes, you saw him, sir? Yes. Oh yes. Likewise the person with him. Person with him, I repeated. I judged the person to be with him, returned the watchman. The person stopped when he stopped to make inquiry of me, and the person took this way when he took this way. What sort of person? The watchman had not particularly noticed. He should say a working person. To the best of his belief, he had a dust-colored kind of clothes on, under a dark coat. The watchman made more light of the matter than I did, and naturally, not having my reason for attaching weight to it, when I had got rid of him, which I thought it well to do without prolonging explanations, my mind was much troubled by these 2 circumstances taken together. While they were easy of innocent solution apart, as for instance, some diner out or diner at home who had not gone near this watchman's gate may have strayed to my staircase and dropped asleep there, and my nameless visitor may have brought someone with him to show him the way. Still, joined, they had an ugly look to one as prone to distrust and fear as the changes of a few hours had made me. I lighted my fire, which burnt with a raw pale flare at that time of the morning, and fell into a doze before it. I seemed to have been dozing a whole night. When the clocks struck 6, as there was full an hour and a half between me and daylight, I dozed again, now waking up uneasily, with prolix conversations about nothing in my ears, now making thunder of the wind in the chimney, at length falling off into a profound sleep, from which the daylight woke me with a start. All this time I had never been able to consider my own situation, nor could I do so yet. I had not the power to attend to it. I was greatly dejected and distressed, but in an incoherent wholesale sort of way. As to forming any plan for the future, I could as soon have formed an elephant. When I opened the shutters and looked out at the wet wild morning, all of a leaden hue, when I walked from room to room, when I sat down again shivering before the fire, waiting for my laundress to appear, I thought how miserable I was, but hardly knew why, or how long I had been so, or on what day of the week I made the reflection, or evening, who I was that made it. At last, the old woman and the niece came in, the latter with a head not easily distinguishable from her dusty broom, and testified surprise at sight of me and the fire, to whom I imparted how my uncle had come in the night and was then asleep, and how the breakfast preparations were to be modified accordingly. Then I washed and dressed while they knocked the furniture about and made a dust, and so, in a sort of dream, or sleep-waking, I found myself sitting by the fire again, waiting for him to come to breakfast soon. His door opened and he came out. I could not bring myself to bear the sight of him, and I thought he had a worse look by daylight. I do not evening know, said I, speaking low as he took his seat at the table. By what name to call you? I have given out that you are my uncle. That's it, dear boy, call me uncle. You assumed some name, I suppose, on board ship? Yes, dear boy, I took the name of Previs. Do you mean to keep that name? Why, yes, dear boy, it's as good as another, unless you'd like another. What is your real name? I asked him in a whisper. Magwitch, he answered in the same tone. Christened Abel. What were you brought up to be? A warmint, dear boy. He answered quite seriously and used the word as if it denoted some profession. When you came into the temple last night, said I, pausing to wonder whether that could really have been last night, which seemed so long ago. Yes, dear boy, when you came in at the gate and asked the watchman the way here, had you any one with you? With me? No, dear boy, but there was someone there. I didn't take particular notice, he said, dubiously, not knowing the ways of the place. But I think there was a person, too, come in a longer. Me, are you known in London? I hope not, said he, giving his neck a jerk with his forefinger, that made me turn hot and sick. Were you known in London once? Not over and above, dear boy. I was in the provinces mostly. Were you tried in London? Which time? Said he, with a sharp look. The last time. He nodded. First knowed Mr. Jaggers that way. Jaggers was for me. It was on my lips to ask him what he was tried for. But he took up a knife, gave it a flourish, and with the words, and what I done is worked out and paid for, fell to at his breakfast. He ate in a ravenous way that was very disagreeable, and all his actions were uncouth, noisy, and greedy. Some of his tests had failed him since. I saw him eat on the marshes, and as he turned his food in his mouth, and turned his head sideways to bring his strongest fangs to bear upon it, he looked terribly like a hungry old dog. If I had begun with any appetite, he would have taken it away, and I should have sat much as I did, repelled from him by an insurmountable aversion, and gloomily looking at the cloth. I'm a heavy grubber, dear boy, he said, as a polite kind of apology, when he made an end of his meal, but I always was. If it had been in my constitution to be a lighter grubber, I may ha got into lighter trouble. Similarly, I must have my smoke. When I was first hired out as shepherd t' other side the world, it's my belief I should ha turned into a melancholy mad sheep myself if I hadn't a had my smoke. As he said so, he got up from table, and putting his hand into the breast of the peacoat he wore, brought out a short black pipe and a handful of loose tobacco of the kind that is called negro head. Having filled his pipe, he put the surplus tobacco back again, as if his pocket were a drawer. Then he took a live coal from the fire with the tongs and lighted his pipe at it, and then turned round on the hearth-rug with his back to the fire, and went through his favorite action of holding out both his hands for mine. And this, said he, dandling my hands up and down in his as he puffed at his pipe, and this is the gentleman what I made, the real genuine one. It does me good fur to look at you, Pip. All I stipulate is to stand by and look at you, dear boy. I released my hands as soon as I could and found that I was beginning slowly to settle down to the contemplation of my condition. What I was chained to, and how heavily, became intelligible to me as I heard his hoarse voice and sat looking up at his furrowed bald head with its iron gray hair at the sides. I mustn't see my gentleman a-footing it in the mire of the streets. There mustn't be no mud on his boots. My gentleman must have horses, Pip, horses to ride, and horses to drive, and horses for his servant to ride and drive as well. Shall colonists have their horses and blood, uns, if you please, good lord, and not my London gentleman? No, no, we'll show 'em another pair of shoes than that, Pip, won't us? He took out of his pocket a great thick pocket-book, bursting with papers, and tossed it on the table. There's something worth spending in that there book, dear boy. It's yourn. All I've got ain't mine, it's yourn. Don't you be afeard on it, there's more where that come from. I've come to the old country fur, to see my gentleman spend his money like a gentleman. That'll be my pleasure 'll be fur to see him do it. And blast you all, he wound up, looking round the room and snapping his fingers once with a loud snap. Blast you every one, from the judge in his wig to the colonist a stirring up the dust. I'll show a better gentleman than the whole kit on you put together. Stop, said I, almost in a frenzy of fear and dislike. I want to speak to you. I want to know what is to be done. I want to know how you are to be kept out of danger, how long you are going to stay, what projects you have. Looky here, Pip, said he, laying his hand on my arm in a suddenly altered and subdued manner. First of all, looky here. I forgot myself half a minute ago. What I said was low. That's what it was, low. Looky here, Pip. Look over it. I ain't a-going to be low. First, I resumed half groaning, what precautions can be taken against your being recognized and seized? No, dear boy, he said in the same tone as before, that don't go first. Lowness goes first. I ain't took so many year to make a gentleman, not without knowing what's due to him. Looky here, Pip. I was low. That's what I was, low. Look over it, dear boy. Some sense of the grim ludicrous moved me to a fretful laugh, as I replied, I have looked over it. In heaven's name, don't harp upon it. Yes, but looky here, he persisted. Dear boy, I ain't come so fur, not fur to be low. Now, go on, dear boy. You was a-saying, how are you to be guarded from the danger you have incurred? Well, dear boy, the danger ain't so great. Without I was informed, agin, the danger ain't so much to signify. There's Jaggers, and there's Wemmick, and there's you. Who else is there to inform? Is there no chance person who may identify you in the street? Said I. Well, he returned, there ain't many, nor yet I don't intend to advertise myself in the newspapers by the name of a come back from Botany Bay, and years have rolled away, and who's to gain by it? Still, looky here, Pip, if the danger had been 50 times as great, I should ha come to see you, mind you, just the same. And how long do you remain? How long? Said he, taking his black pipe from his mouth, and dropping his jaw as he stared at me. I'm not a-going back. I've come for good. Where are you to live? Said I. What is to be done with you? Where will you be safe? Dear boy, he returned, there's disguising wigs can be bought for money, and there's hair powder and spectacles and black clothes, shorts and what not. Others has done it safe afore, and what others has done afore, others can do agin. As to the where and how of living, dear boy, give me your own opinions on it. You take it smoothly now, said I, but you were very serious last night when you swore it was death. And so I swear it is death, said he, putting his pipe back in his mouth, and death by the rope in the open street not far from this, and it's serious that you should fully understand it to be so. What then, when that's once done? Here I am. To go back now 'ud be as bad as to stand ground, worse. Besides, Pip, I'm here because I've meant it by youth years and years. As to what I dare, I'm a old bird now as has dared all manner of traps since first he was fledged, and I'm not afeard to perch upon a scarecrow. If there's death hid inside of it, there is, and let him come out, and I'll face him, and then I'll believe in him, and not afore. And now let me have a look at my gentleman agent. Once more he took me by both hands and surveyed me with an air of admiring proprietorship, smoking with great complacency all the while. It appeared to me that I could do no better than secure him some quiet lodging hard by, of which he may take possession when Herbert returned, whom I expected in 2 or 3 days. That the secret must be confided to Herbert as a matter of unavoidable necessity, evening if I could have put the immense relief I should derive from sharing it with him out of the question was plain to me. But it was by no means so plain to Mr. Purvis. I resolved to call him by that name, who reserved his consent to Herbert's participation until he should have seen him, and formed a favorable judgment of his physiognomy. "And evening then, dear boy," said he, pulling a greasy little clasped black testament out of his pocket. "We'll have him on his oath to state that my terrible patron carried this little black book about the world solely to swear people on in cases of emergency would be to state what I never quite established, but this I can say, that I never knew him put it to any other use." The book itself had the appearance of having been stolen from some court of justice, and perhaps his knowledge of its antecedents, combined with his own experience in that wise, gave him a reliance on its powers as a sort of legal spell or charm. On this first occasion of his producing it, I recalled how he had made me swear fidelity in the churchyard long ago, and how he had described himself last night as always swearing to his resolutions in his solitude, as he was at present dressed in a seafaring slop suit, in which he looked as if he had some parrots and cigars to dispose of. I next discussed with him what dress he should wear. He cherished an extraordinary belief in the virtues of shorts as a disguise, and had in his own mind sketched a dress for himself that would have made him something between a dean and a dentist. It was with considerable difficulty that I won him over to the assumption of a dress more like a prosperous farmer's, and we arranged that he should cut his hair close and wear a little powder. Lastly, as he had not yet been seen by the laundress or her niece, he was to keep himself out of their view until his change of dress was made. It would seem a simple matter to decide on these precautions, but in my dazed, not to say distracted, state, it took so long that I did not get out to further them until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. He was to remain shut up in the chambers while I was gone, and was on no account to open the door, there being to my knowledge a respectable lodging-house in Essex Street, the back of which looked into the Temple, and was almost within hail of my windows. I first of all repaired to that house, and was so fortunate as to secure the second floor for my uncle, Mr. Purvis. I then went from shop to shop, making such purchases as were necessary to the change in his appearance. This business transacted, I turned my face, on my own account, to Little Britain. Mr. Jaggers was at his desk, but seeing me enter, got up immediately and stood before his fire. "Now, Pip," said he, "be careful." "I will, sir," I returned, for coming along I had thought well of what I was going to say. "Don't commit yourself," said Mr. Jaggers, "and don't commit any one. You understand, any one. Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know anything. I am not curious." Of course I saw that he knew the man was come. "I merely want, Mr. Jaggers," said I, "to assure myself that what I have been told is true. I have no hope of its being untrue, but at least I may verify it." Mr. Jaggers nodded. "But did you say told or informed?" he asked me, with his head on one side, and not looking at me, but looking in a listening way at the floor. "Told would seem to imply verbal communication. You can't have verbal communication with a man in New South Wales, you know." "I will say informed, Mr. Jaggers." "Good. I have been informed by a person named Abel Magwitch that he is the benefactor so long unknown to me." "That is the man," said Mr. Jaggers, "in New South Wales." "And only he?" said I. "And only he," said Mr. Jaggers. "I am not so unreasonable, sir, as to think you at all responsible for my mistakes and wrong conclusions, but I always supposed it was Miss Havisham, as you say." "Pip," returned Mr. Jaggers, turning his eyes upon me coolly, and taking a bite at his forefinger, "I am not at all responsible for that. And yet it looked so like it, sir," I pleaded with a downcast heart. Not a particle of evidence, Pip, said Mr. Jaggers, shaking his head and gathering up his skirts. Take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence. There's no better rule. I have no more to say, said I, with a sigh, after standing silent for a little while. I have verified my information, and there's an end. And Magwitch, in New South Wales, having at last disclosed himself, said Mr. Jaggers, you will comprehend, Pip, how rigidly throughout my communication with you I have always adhered to the strict line of fact. There has never been the least departure from the strict line of fact. You are quite aware of that. Quite, sir. I communicated to Magwitch, in New South Wales, when he first wrote to me from New South Wales, the caution that he must not expect me ever to deviate from the strict line of fact. I also communicated to him another caution. He appeared to me to have obscurely hinted in his letter at some distant idea he had of seeing you in England here. I cautioned him that I must hear no more of that he was not at all likely to obtain a pardon, that he was expatriated for the term of his natural life, and that his presenting himself in this country would be an act of felony, rendering him liable to the extreme penalty of the law. I gave Magwitch that caution, said Mr. Jaggers, looking hard at me. I wrote it to New South Wales. He guided himself by it, no doubt, no doubt, said I. I have been informed by Wemmick, pursued Mr. Jaggers, still looking hard at me, that he has received a letter, under date Portsmouth, from a colonist of the name of Purvis or Purvis, I suggested. Or Purvis, thank you, Pip. Perhaps it is Purvis. Perhaps you know it's Purvis. Yes, said I. You know it's Purvis. A letter, under date Portsmouth, from a colonist of the name of Purvis, asking for the particulars of your address, on behalf of Magwitch. Wemmick sent him the particulars, I understand, by return of post. Probably it is through Purvis that you have received the explanation of Magwitch in New South Wales. It came through Purvis, I replied. Good day, Pip, said Mr. Jaggers, offering his hand. Glad to have seen you. In writing by post to Magwitch in New South Wales, or in communicating with him through Purvis, have the goodness to mention that the particulars and vouchers of our long account shall be sent to you, together with the balance, for there is still a balance remaining. Good day, Pip. We shook hands, and he looked hard at me as long as he could see me. I turned at the door, and he was still looking hard at me, while the two vile casts on the shelf seemed to be trying to get their eyelids open and to force out of their swollen throats. Oh, what a man he is. Wemmick was out, and though he had been at his desk he could have done nothing for me. I went straight back to the temple, where I found the terrible Purvis drinking rum and water and smoking Negro head in safety. Next day the clothes I had ordered all came home, and he put them on. Whatever he put on became him less, it dismally seemed to me, than what he had worn before. To my thinking, there was something in him that made it hopeless to attempt to disguise him. The more I dressed him and the better I dressed him, the more he looked like the slouching fugitive on the marshes. This effect on my anxious fancy was partly referable, no doubt, to his old face and manner growing more familiar to me, but I believe too that he dragged one of his legs as if there were still a weight of iron on it, and that from head to foot there was convict in the very grain of the man. The influences of his solitary hut life were upon him besides, and gave him a savage air that no dress could tame. Added to these were the influences of his subsequent branded life among men, and, crowning all, his consciousness that he was dodging and hiding now in all his ways of sitting and standing and eating and drinking, of brooding about in a high-shouldered reluctant style, of taking out his great horn-handled jackknife and wiping it on his legs and cutting his food, of lifting light glasses and cups to his lips as if they were clumsy pannikins, of chopping a wedge off his bread and soaking up with it the last fragments of gravy round and round his plate, as if to make the most of an allowance, and then drying his finger ends on it, and then swallowing it. In these ways, and 1,000 other small nameless instances arising every minute in the day, there was prisoner, felon, bondsman, plain as plain could be. It had been his own idea to wear that touch of powder, and I had conceded the powder after overcoming the shorts. But I can compare the effect of it, when on, to nothing but the probable effect of rouge upon the dead. So awful was the manner in which everything in him that it was most desirable to repress started through that thin layer of pretense and seemed to come blazing out at the crown of his head. It was abandoned as soon as tried, and he wore his grizzled hair cut short. Words cannot tell what a sense I had at the same time of the dreadful mystery that he was to me, when he fell asleep of an evening, with his knotted hands clenching the sides of the easy-chair, and his bald head tattooed with deep wrinkles falling forward on his breast. I would sit and look at him, wondering what he had done, and loading him with all the crimes in the calendar, until the impulse was powerful on me to start up and fly from him. Every hour so increased my abhorrence of him, that I evening think I may have yielded to this impulse in the first agonies of being so haunted, notwithstanding all he had done for me and the risk he ran, but for the knowledge that Herbert must soon come back. Once, I actually did start out of bed in the night and begin to dress myself in my worst clothes, hurriedly intending to leave him there with everything else I possessed and enlist for India as a private soldier. I doubt if a ghost could have been more terrible to me, up in those lonely rooms in the long evenings and long nights, with the wind and the rain always rushing by. A ghost could not have been taken and hanged on my account, and the consideration that he could be, and the dread that he would be, were no small addition to my horrors. When he was not asleep, or playing a complicated kind of patience with a ragged pack of cards of his own, a game that I never saw before or since, and in which he recorded his winnings by sticking his jackknife into the table. When he was not engaged in either of these pursuits, he would ask me to read to him foreign language, dear boy. While I complied, he, not comprehending a single word, would stand before the fire surveying me with the air of an exhibitor, and I would see him, between the fingers of the hand with which I shaded my face, appealing in dumb show to the furniture to take notice of my proficiency. The imaginary student, pursued by the misshapen creature he had impiously made, was not more wretched than I, pursued by the creature who had made me, and recoiling from him with a stronger repulsion, the more he admired me and the fonder he was of me. This is written of, I am sensible, as if it had lasted a year. It lasted about 5 days. Expecting Herbert all the time, I dared not go out, except when I took Provis for an airing after dark. At length, one evening when dinner was over and I had dropped into a slumber quite worn out, for my nights had been agitated and my rest broken by fearful dreams, I was roused by the welcome footstep on the staircase. Provis, who had been asleep too, staggered up at the noise I made, and in an instant I saw his jackknife shining in his hand. "Quiet, it's Herbert," I said, and Herbert came bursting in, with the airy freshness of 600 miles of France upon him. "Handel, my dear fellow, how are you? And again, how are you? And again, how are you? I seem to have been gone a 12 a month. Why, so I must have been, for you have grown quite thin and pale. Handel, my halloa, I beg your pardon." He was stopped in his running on and in his shaking hands with me by seeing Provis. Provis, regarding him with a fixed attention, was slowly putting up his jackknife and groping in another pocket for something else. Herbert, my dear friend, said I, shutting the double doors, while Herbert stood staring and wondering. Something very strange has happened. This is a visitor of mine. It's all right, dear boy, said Purvis, coming forward with his little clasped black book, and then addressing himself to Herbert. Take it in your right hand. Lord strike you dead on the spot, if ever you split in any way sumever. Kiss it. Do so as he wishes it, I said to Herbert. So, Herbert, looking at me with a friendly uneasiness and amazement, complied, and Purvis, immediately shaking hands with him, said, Now you're on your oath. You? No. Chapter Roman 41. In vain should I attempt to describe the astonishment and disquiet of Herbert when he and I and Purvis sat down before the fire, and I recounted the whole of the secret. Enough that I saw my own feelings reflected in Herbert's face, and not least among them my repugnance towards the man who had done so much for me. What would alone have set a division between that man and us, if there had been no other dividing circumstance, was his triumph in my story, saving his troublesome sense of having been low on one occasion since his return, on which point he began to hold forth to Herbert. The moment my revelation was finished, he had no perception of the possibility of my finding any fault with my good fortune. His boast that he had made me a gentleman, and that he had come to see me support the character on his ample resources, was made for me quite as much as for himself, and that it was a highly agreeable boast to both of us, and that we must both be very proud of it, was a conclusion quite established in his own mind. Though, look'ee here, Pip's comrade, he said to Herbert, after having discoursed for some time, I know very well that once since I come back for half a minute, I've been low. I said to Pip I knowed as I had been low, but don't you fret yourself on that score. I ain't made Pip a gentleman, and Pip ain't a-going to make you a gentleman, not for me not to know what's due to ye both. Dear boy, and Pip's comrade, you too may count upon me always having a genteel muzzle on. Muzzled I have been, since that half a minute when I was betrayed into lowness. Muzzled I am, at the present time, muzzled I ever will be. Herbert said, certainly, but looked as if there were no specific consolation in this, and remained perplexed and dismayed. We were anxious for the time when he would go to his lodging and leave us together, but he was evidently jealous of leaving us together, and sat late. It was midnight before I took him round to Essex Street, and saw him safely in at his own dark door. When it closed upon him, I experienced the first moment of relief I had known since the night of his arrival. Never quite free from an uneasy remembrance of the man on the stairs, I had always looked about me in taking my guest out after dark, and in bringing him back, and I looked about me now, difficult as it is in a large city to avoid the suspicion of being watched. When the mind is conscious of danger in that regard, I could not persuade myself that any of the people within sight cared about my movements. The few who were passing passed on their several ways, and the street was empty when I turned back into the temple. Nobody had come out at the gate with us. Nobody went in at the gate with me. As I crossed by the fountain, I saw his lighted back windows looking bright and quiet, and when I stood for a few moments in the doorway of the building where I lived, before going up the stairs, Garden Court was as still and lifeless as the staircase was when I ascended it. Herbert received me with open arms, and I had never felt before so blessedly what it is to have a friend. When he had spoken some sound words of sympathy and encouragement, we sat down to consider the question what was to be done. The chair that Purvis had occupied still remaining where it had stood, for he had a barrack way with him of hanging about one spot, in one unsettled manner, and going through one round of observances with his pipe and his negro head and his jackknife and his pack of cards, and what not, as if it were all put down for him on a slate. I say his chair remaining where it had stood, Herbert unconsciously took it but next moment started out of it, pushed it away, and took another. He had no occasion to say after that he had conceived an aversion for my patron, neither had I occasion to confess my own. We interchanged that confidence without shaping a syllable. "What," said I to Herbert, when he was safe in another chair, "what is to be done?" "My poor dear Handel," he replied, holding his head, "I am too stunned to think." "So was I, Herbert, when the blow first fell. Still, something must be done. He is intent upon various new expenses, horses and carriages, and lavish appearances of all kinds. He must be stopped somehow." "You mean that you can't accept?" "How can I interposed, as Herbert paused. "Think of him. Look at him." An involuntary shudder passed over both of us. "Yet I am afraid the dreadful truth is, Herbert, that he is attached to me, strongly attached to me. Was there ever such a fate?" "My poor dear Handel," Herbert repeated. "Then," said I, after all, stopping short here, never taking another penny from him, "think what I owe him already. Then again, I am heavily in debt, very heavily for me, who have now no expectations, and I have been bred to no calling, and I am fit for nothing." "Well, well, well," Herbert remonstrated. "Don't say fit for nothing. What am I fit for? I know only one thing that I'm fit for, and that is to go for a soldier. And I may have gone, my dear Herbert, but for the prospect of taking counsel with your friendship and affection. Of course I broke down there, and of course Herbert, beyond seizing a warm grip of my hand, pretended not to know it. Anyhow, my dear Handel, said he soon, soldiering won't do. If you were to renounce this patronage and these favors, I suppose you would do so with some faint hope of one day repaying what you have already had. Not very strong, that hope, if you went soldiering. Besides, it's absurd. You would be infinitely better in Clarriker's house, small as it is. I am working up towards a partnership, you know. Poor fellow, he little suspected with whose money. But there is another question, said Herbert. This is an ignorant, determined man, who has long had one fixed idea. More than that, he seems to me I may misjudge him to be a man of a desperate and fierce character. I know he is, I returned. Let me tell you what evidence I have seen of it. And I told him what I had not mentioned in my narrative of that encounter with the other convict. "See, then," said Herbert, "think of this. He comes here at the peril of his life, for the realization of his fixed idea. In the moment of realization, after all his toil and waiting, you cut the ground from under his feet, destroy his idea, and make his gains worthless to him. Do you see nothing that he may do under the disappointment? I have seen it, Herbert, and dreamed of it ever since the fatal night of his arrival. Nothing has been in my thoughts so distinctly as his putting himself in the way of being taken." "Then you may rely upon it," said Herbert, "that there would be great danger of his doing it. That is his power over you as long as he remains in England, and that would be his reckless course if you forsook him." I was so struck by the horror of this idea, which had weighed upon me from the first, and the working out of which would make me regard myself, in some sort, as his murderer, that I could not rest in my chair, but began pacing to and fro. I said to Herbert, meanwhile, that evening if Provis were recognized and taken, in spite of himself, I should be wretched as the cause, however innocently. Yes, evening though I was so wretched in having him at large and near me, an evening though I would far rather have worked at the forge all the days of my life than I would ever have come to this. But there was no staving off the question. What was to be done? "The first and the main thing to be done," said Herbert, "is to get him out of England. You will have to go with him, and then he may be induced to go. But get him where I will, could I prevent his coming back? My good Handel, is it not obvious that with Newgate in the next street, there must be far greater hazard in your breaking your mind to him and making him reckless here than elsewhere? if a pretext to get him away could be made out of that other convict, or out of anything else in his life. Now, there, again, said I, stopping before Herbert, with my open hands held out as if they contained the desperation of the case. I know nothing of his life. It has almost made me mad to sit here of a night and see him before me, so bound up with my fortunes and misfortunes, and yet so unknown to me, except as the miserable wretch who terrified me 2 days in my childhood. Herbert got up and linked his arm in mine, and we slowly walked to and fro together, studying the carpet. Handel, said Herbert, stopping, you feel convinced that you can take no further benefits from him, do you? Fully. Surely you would, too, if you were in my place. And you feel convinced that you must break with him? Herbert, can you ask me? And you have, and are bound to have, that tenderness for the life he has risked on your account, that you must save him, if possible, from throwing it away. Then you must get him out of England before you stir a finger to extricate yourself. That done, extricate yourself, in heaven's name, and we'll see it out together, dear old boy. It was a comfort to shake hands upon it, and walk up and down again, with only that done. Now, Herbert, said I, with reference to gaining some knowledge of his history, there is but one way that I know of. I must ask him point blank. Yes, ask him, said Herbert, when we sit at breakfast in the morning, for he had said, on taking leave of Herbert, that he would come to breakfast with us. With this project formed, we went to bed. I had the wildest dreams concerning him, and woke unrefreshed. I woke, too, to recover the fear, which I had lost in the night, of his being found out as a returned transport. Waking, I never lost that fear. He came round at the appointed time, took out his jackknife, and sat down to his meal. He was full of plans for his gentleman's coming out, strong and like a gentleman, and urged me to begin speedily upon the pocket-book which he had left in my possession. He considered the chambers and his own lodging as temporary residences, and advised me to look out at once for a fashionable crib near Hyde Park, in which he could have a shakedown. When he had made an end of his breakfast, and was wiping his knife on his leg, I said to him, without a word of preface, after you were gone last night, I told my friend of the struggle that the soldiers found you engaged in on the marshes when we came up. You remember, said he. I think so. We want to know something about that man and about you. It is strange to know no more about either, and particularly you, than I was able to tell last night. Is not this as good a time as another for our knowing more? Well, he said, after consideration. You're on your oath, you know, Pip's comrade? Assuredly, replied Herbert. As to anything I say, you know, he insisted. The oath applies to all. I understand it to do so. And looky here, whatever I done is worked out and paid for, he insisted again. So be it. He took out his black pipe and was going to fill it with negro head, when, looking at the tangle of tobacco in his hand, he seemed to think it may perplex the thread of his narrative. Chapter Roman 42, Dear Boy and Pip's Comrade. I am not a-going fur to tell you my life, like a song or a story book, but to give it you short and handy, I'll put it at once into a mouthful of English. In jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail, in jail and out of jail. There, you've got it. That's my life pretty much, down to such times as I got shipped off. Arter Pip stood my friend. I've been done everything too, pretty well, except hanged. I've been locked up as much as a silver tea kettle. I've been carted here and carted there, and put out of this town, and put out of that town, and stuck in the stocks, and whipped and worried and drove. I've no more notion where I was born than you have, if so much. I first become aware of myself down in Essex, a-thieving turnips for my living. Someone had run away from me, a man, a tinker, and he'd took the fire with him, and left me worry cold. I knowed my name to be Magwitch, christened Abel. How did I know it? Much as I knowed the birds' names in the hedges to be chaffinch, sparrow, thrush. I may have thought it was all lies together, only as the birds' names come out true, I supposed mine did. So fur as I could find, there warn't a soul that see young Abel, Magwitch, with us little on him as in him, but what caught fright at him, and either drove him off, or took him up. I was took up, to that extent that I regularly growed up took up. This is the way it was, that when I was a ragged little creetur as much to be pitied as ever I see not that I looked in the glass, for there warn't many insides of furnished houses known to me. I got the name of being hardened. This is a terrible hardened one, they says to prison. Wisitors picking out me may be said to live in jails, this boy. Then they looked at me, and I looked at them, and they measured my head, some on they had better a measured my stomach, and others on give me tracts what I couldn't read, and made me speeches what I couldn't understand. They always went on agin me about the devil. But what the devil was I to do? I must put something into my stomach, mustn't I? Howsomever, I'm a getting low, and I know what's due. Dear boy and Pip's comrade, don't you be afeard of me being low, tramping, begging, thieving, working sometimes when I could, though that warn't as often as you may think, till you put the question whether you would hop been over ready to give me work yourselves, a bit of a poacher, a bit of a laborer, a bit of a wagoner, a bit of a haymaker, a bit of a hawker, a bit of most things that don't pay and lead to trouble. I got to be a man, a deserting soldier in a traveler's rest. What lay hid up to the chin under a lot of tatters, learnt me to read. And a traveling giant what signed his name at a penny a time learnt me to write. I warn't locked up as often now as formerly, but I wore out my good share of key medals still. At Epsom races, a matter of over 20 years ago, I got acquainted why a man whose skull I'd crack why this poker, like the claw of a lobster, if I'd got it on this hop. His right name was Compison, and that's the man, dear boy, what you see me a-pounding in the ditch, according to what you truly told your comrade arter I was gone last night. He set up for a gentleman, this Compison, and he'd been to a public boarding school and had learning. He was a smooth one to talk, and was a dab at the ways of gentlefolks. He was good-looking, too. It was the night afore the great race, when I found him on the heath, in a booth, that I knowed on. Him and some more was a-sitting among the tables when I went in, and the landlord which had a knowledge of me, and was a sporting one called him out, and said, I think this is a man that may suit you, meaning I was Compison. He looks at me very noticing, and I look at him. He has a watch and a chain, and a ring, and a breastpin, and a handsome suit of clothes. To judge from appearances, you're out of luck, says Compison to me. Yes, master, and I've never been in it much. I had come out of Kingston jail last on a vagrancy committal, not but what it may have been for something else, but it warn't. Luck changes, says Compison. Perhaps yours is going to change. I says, I hope it may be so. There's room. What can you do? Says Compison. Eat and drink, I says, if you'll find the materials. Compison laughed, looked at me again very noticing, give me 5 shillings, and appointed me for next night. Same place. I went to Compison next night. Same place, and Compison took me on to be his man and pardner. And what was Compison's business in which we was to go pardners? Compison's business was the swindling, handwriting, forging, stolen banknote passing, and such like, all sorts of traps as Compison could set with his head and keep his own legs out of and get the profits from and let another man in for, was Compison's business. He'd no more heart than an iron file, he was as cold as death, and he had the head of the devil aforementioned. There was another in with Compison, as was called Arthur, not as being so christened, but as a surname. He was in a decline, and was a shadow to look at. Him and Compeyson had been in a bad thing with a rich lady some years afore, and they'd made a pot of money by it. But Compeyson betted and gamed, and he'd have run through the king's taxes. So Arthur was a dying poor, and with a whores on him, and Compeyson's wife, which Compeyson kicked mostly, was a having pity on him when she could, and Compeyson was a having pity on nothing and nobody. I may a took warning by Arthur, but I didn't, and I won't pretend I was particular, for where 'ud be the good on it, dear boy and comrade? So I begun why Compeyson, and a poor tool I was in his hands. Arthur lived at the top of Compeyson's house over near Brentford it was, and Compeyson kept a careful account agin him for board and lodging, in case he should ever get better to work it out. But Arthur soon settled the account. The second or third time as ever I see him, he come a tearing down into Compeyson's parlour late at night, in only a flannel gown, with his hair all in a sweat, and he says to Compeyson's wife, Sally, she really is upstairs alonger me now, and I can't get rid of her. She's all in white, he says, why white flowers in her hair, and she's awful mad, and she's got a shroud hanging over her arm, and she says she'll put it on me at 5 in the morning. Says Compeyson, why, you fool, don't you know she's got a living body? And how should she be up there, without coming through the door, or in at the window, and up the stairs? I don't know how she's there, says Arthur, shivering dreadful with the horrors, but she's standing in the corner at the foot of the bed, awful mad. And over where her heart's broke, you broke it. There's drops of blood. Compeyson spoke hearty, but he was always a coward. Go up alonger this drivelling sick man, he says to his wife, and Magwitch, lend her a hand, will you? But he never come near himself. Compeyson's wife and me took him up to bed agin, and he raved most dreadful. Why, look at her, he cries out, she's a shaking the shroud at me. Don't you see her? Look at her eyes. Ain't it awful to see her so mad? Next he cries, she'll put it on me, and then I'm done for. Take it away from her, take it away. And then he catched hold of us, and kept on a talking to her, and answering of her, till I half believed I see her myself. Compeyson's wife, being used to him, give him some liquor to get the horse off, and soon he quieted. Oh, she's gone. Has her keeper been for her? He says. Yes, says Compeyson's wife. Did you tell him to lock her and bar her in? Yes. And to take that ugly thing away from her? Yes, yes, all right. You're a good creetur, he says. Don't leave me, whatever you do, and thank you. He rested pretty quiet till it may want a few minutes of 5, and then he starts up with a scream, and screams out, here she is. She's got the shroud again. She's unfolding it. She's coming out of the corner. She's coming to the bed. Hold me, both on you, one of each side. Don't let her touch me with it. Ha! She missed me that time. Don't let her throw it over my shoulders. Don't let her lift me up to get it round me. She's lifting me up. Keep me down. Then he lifted himself up hard and was dead. Compeyson took it easy as a good riddance for both sides. Him and me was soon busy, and first he swore me'd being ever artful on my own book, this here little black book, dear boy, what I swore your comrade on, not to go into the things that Compeyson planned and I done, which 'ud take a week. I'll simply say to you, dear boy and Pip's comrade, that man got me into such nets as made me his black slave. I was always in debt to him, always under his thumb, always a working, always a getting into danger. He was younger than me, but he'd got craft, and he'd got learning, and he overmatched me 500 times told, and no mercy. My missus says I had the hard time. Why, stop though, I ain't brought her in. He looked about him in a confused way, as if he had lost his place in the book of his remembrance, and he turned his face to the fire, and spread his hands broader on his knees, and lifted them off and put them on again. There ain't no need to go into it, he said. looking round once more. The time why comparison was a most as hard a time as ever I had. That, said, all said. Did I tell you as I was tried, alone, for misdemeanor, while with comparison? I answered, no. Well, he said, I was, and got convicted. As to took up on suspicion, that was twice or three times in the 4 or 5 year that it lasted, but evidence was wanting. At last, me and Compison was both committed for felony on a charge of putting stolen notes in circulation, and there was other charges behind. Compison says to me, separate defenses, no communication, and that was all. And I was so miserable, poor, that I sold all the clothes I had, except what hung on my back, afore I could get jaggers. When we was put in the dock, I noticed first of all what a gentleman Compison looked, why his curly hair and his black clothes and his white pocket handkercher, and what a common sort of a wretch I looked. When the prosecution opened and the evidence was put short aforehand, I noticed how heavy it all bore on me, and how light on him. When the evidence was give in the box, I noticed how it was always me that had come forward and could be swore to, how it was always me that the money had been paid to, how it was always me that had seemed to work the thing and get the profit. But when the defense come on, then I see the plan plainer, for, says the counselor for Compison, my lord and gentlemen, here you has afore you, side by side, two persons as your eyes can, separate wide, one, the younger, well brought up, who will be spoke to as such, one, the elder, ill brought up, who will be spoke to as such. One, the younger, seldom if ever seen in these here transactions, and only suspected. T'other, the elder, always seen in and always wi' his guilt brought home. Can you doubt, if there is but one in it, which is the one, and if there is two in it, which is much the worst one? And such like, and when it come to character, warrant it Compison as had been to the school, and warranted his schoolfellows as was in this position and in that, and warranted him as had been knowed by witnesses in such clubs and societies, and nout to his disadvantage, and warranted me as had been tried afore, and as had been knowed up hill and down dale, in bridewells and lockups, and when it come to speech making, warranted Compison as could speak to why his face dropping every now and then into his white pocket handkercher, all, and why verses in his speech too, and warranted me as could only say, gentlemen, this man at my side is a most precious rascal. And when the verdict come, warranted Compison as was recommended to mercy on account of good character and bad company, and giving up all the information he could agent me, and warranted me as got never a word but guilty. And when I says to Compison, once out of this court, I'll smash that face of yourn, ain't it Compison as prays the judge to be protected and gets two turkeys stood between us? And when we're sentenced, ain't it him as gets 7 year and me 14, and ain't it him as the judge is sorry for, because he may a done so well, and ain't it me as the judge perceives to be a old offender of will and passion, likely to come to worse. He had worked himself into a state of great excitement, but he checked it, took 2 or 3 short breaths, swallowed as often, and stretching out his hand towards me said, in a reassuring manner, I ain't a-going to be low, dear boy. He had so heated himself that he took out his handkerchief and wiped his face and head and neck and hands before he could go on. I had said to Compison that I'd smash that face of his, and I swore, Lord smash mine, to do it. We was in the same prison ship, but I couldn't get at him for long, though I tried. At last I come behind him, and hit him on the cheek to turn him round, and get a smashing one at him, when I was seen and seized. The black hole of that ship warrant, a strong one, to a judge of black holes that could swim and dive. I escaped to the shore, and I was a hiding among the graves there, envying them as was an and all over. When I first see my boy, he regarded me with a look of affection that made him almost abhorrent to me again, though I had felt great pity for him. By my boy, I was jive to understand as Compison was out on them marshes, too. Upon my soul, I half believe he escaped in his terror, to get quit of me, not knowing it was me as had got ashore. I hunted him down. I smashed his face. And now, says I, as the worst thing I can do, caring nothing for myself, I'll drag you back. And I'd have swum off, towing him by the hair, if it had come to that, and I'd a got him aboard, without the soldiers. Of course he'd much the best of it to the last, his character was so good. He had escaped when he was made half wild by me and my murderous intentions, and his punishment was light. I was put in irons, brought to trial again, and sent for life. I didn't stop for life, dear boy, and Pitt's comrade being here, he wiped himself again, as he had done before, and then slowly took his tangle of tobacco from his pocket, and plucked his pipe from his buttonhole, and slowly filled it, and began to smoke. Is he dead? I asked, after a silence. Is who dead, dear boy? Compison. He hopes I am. If he's alive, you may be sure, with a fierce look. Bye. Never heard no more of him. Herbert had been writing with his pencil in the cover of a book. He softly pushed the book over to me, as Provis stood smoking with his eyes on the fire, and I read in it, young Havisham's name was Arthur. Chapter Roman 43. Why should I pause to ask how much of my shrinking from Provis may be traced to Estella? Why should I loiter on my road to compare the state of mind in which I had tried to rid myself of the stain of the prison before meeting her at the coach office, with the state of mind in which I now reflected on the abyss between Estella in her pride and beauty, and the returned transport whom I harbored? The road would be none the smoother for it, the end would be none the better for it. He would not be helped, nor I extenuated. A new fear had been engendered in my mind by his narrative, or rather, his narrative had given form and purpose to the fear that was already there. If Compison were alive and should discover his return, I could hardly doubt the consequence. That Compison stood in mortal fear of him, neither of the two could know much better than I, and that any such man as that man had been described to be would hesitate to release himself for good from a dreaded enemy by the safe means of becoming an informer was scarcely to be imagined. Never had I breathed, and never would I breathe, or so I resolved, a word of Estella to Provis. But I said to Herbert that, before I could go abroad, I must see both Estella and Miss Havisham. This was when we were left alone on the night of the day when Provis told us his story. I resolved to go out to Richmond next day, and I went. On my presenting myself at Mrs. Brandley's, Estella's maid was called to tell that Estella had gone into the country. Where? To Sati's house, as usual. Not as usual, I said, for she had never yet gone there without me. When was she coming back? There was an air of reservation in the answer which increased my perplexity, and the answer was that her maid believed she was only coming back at all for a little while. I could make nothing of this, except that it was meant that I should make nothing of it, and I went home again in complete discomfiture. Another night consultation with Herbert after Provis was gone home. I always took him home, and always looked well about me, led us to the conclusion that nothing should be said about going abroad until I came back from Miss Havisham's. In the meantime, Herbert and I were to consider separately what it would be best to say, whether we should devise any pretense of being afraid that he was under suspicious observation, or whether I, who had never yet been abroad, should propose an expedition. We both knew that I had but to propose anything, and he would consent. We agreed that his remaining many days in his present hazard was not to be thought of. Next day I had the meanness to feign that I was under a binding promise to go down to Joe, but I was capable of almost any meanness towards Joe, or his name. Provis was to be strictly careful while I was gone, and Herbert was to take the charge of him that I had taken. I was to be absent only one night, and, on my return, the gratification of his impatience for my starting as a gentleman on a greater scale was to be begun. It occurred to me then, and as I afterwards found to Herbert also, that he may be best got away across the water, on that pretence as to make purchases or the like. Having thus cleared the way for my expedition to Miss Havisham's, I set off by the early morning coach before it was yet light, and was out on the open country road when the day came creeping on, halting and whimpering and shivering, and wrapped in patches of cloud and rags of mist, like a beggar. When we drove up to the Blue Boar after a drizzly ride, whom should I see come out under the gateway, toothpick in hand, to look at the coach, but Bentley Drummle. As he pretended not to see me, I pretended not to see him. It was a very lame pretense on both sides, the lamer because we both went into the coffee room, where he had just finished his breakfast, and where I ordered mine. It was poisonous to me to see him in the town, for I very well knew why he had come there, pretending to read a smeary newspaper long out of date, which had nothing half so legible in its local news as the foreign matter of coffee, pickles, fish sauces, gravy, melted butter, and wine, with which it was sprinkled all over, as if it had taken the measles in a highly irregular form. I sat at my table while he stood before the fire. By degrees it became an enormous injury to me that he stood before the fire, and I got up, determined to have my share of it. I had to put my hand behind his legs for the poker when I went up to the fireplace to stir the fire, but still pretended not to know him. "Is this a cut?" said Mr. Drummle. "Oh," said I, poker in hand, "it's you, is it? How do you do?" I was wondering who it was who kept the fire off. With that, I poked tremendously, and having done so, planted myself side by side with Mr. Drummle, my shoulders squared and my back to the fire. "You have just come down?" said Mr. Drummle, edging me a little away with his shoulder. "Yes," said I, edging him a little away with my shoulder. "Beastly place," said Drummle. "Your part of the country, I think?" "Yes," I assented. "I am told it's very like your Shropshire." "Not in the least like it," said Drummle. Here Mr. Drummle looked at his boots, and I looked at mine, and then Mr. Drummle looked at my boots, and I looked at his. "Have you been here long?" I asked, determined not to yield an inch of the fire. "Long enough to be tired of it," returned Drummle, pretending to yawn, but equally determined. "Do you stay here long?" "Can't say," answered Mr. Drummle. "Do you?" "Can't say," said I. I felt here, through a tingling in my blood, that if Mr. Drummle's shoulder had claimed another hair's breadth of room, I should have jerked him into the window. Equally, that if my own shoulder had urged a similar claim, Mr. Drummle would have jerked me into the nearest box. He whistled a little. So did I. "Large tract of marshes about here, I believe," said Drummle. "Yes." "What of that?" said I. Mr. Drummle looked at me, and then at my boots, and then said, "Oh," and laughed. "Are you amused, Mr. Drummle?" "No," said he, "not particularly. I am going out for a ride in the saddle. I mean to explore those marshes for amusement. Out of the way villages there, they tell me, curious little public houses and smithies and that. Waiter." "Yes, sir." "Is that horse of mine ready?" "Brought round to the door, sir." "I say, look here, you sir, the lady won't ride today. The weather won't do." "Very good, sir. And I don't dine, because I'm going to dine at the lady's." "Very good, sir." Then Drummle glanced at me, with an insolent triumph on his great jowled face that cut me to the heart, dull as he was, and so exasperated me that I felt inclined to take him in my arms as the robber in the story book is said to have taken the old lady and seat him on the fire. One thing was manifest to both of us, and that was that until relief came, neither of us could relinquish the fire. There we stood, well, squared up before it, shoulder to shoulder and foot to foot, with our hands behind us, not budging an inch. The horse was visible outside in the drizzle at the door. My breakfast was put on the table. Drummel's was cleared away. The waiter invited me to begin. I nodded. We both stood our ground. Have you been to the Grove since? Said Drummel. No, said I. I had quite enough of the Finches the last time I was there. Was that when we had a difference of opinion? Yes, I replied, very shortly. Come, come. They let you off easily enough, sneered Drummel. You shouldn't have lost your temper. Mr. Drummel, said I, you are not competent to give advice on that subject. When I lose my temper, not that I admit having done so on that occasion, I don't throw glasses. I do, said Drummel, after glancing at him once or twice, in an increased state of smoldering ferocity. I said, Mr. Drummel, I did not seek this conversation, and I don't think it an agreeable one. I am sure it's not, said he, superciliously over his shoulder. I don't think anything about it, and therefore, I went on, with your leave, I will suggest that we hold no kind of communication in future. Quite my opinion, said Drummel, and what I should have suggested myself, or done, more likely, without suggesting. But don't lose your temper. Haven't you lost enough without that? What do you mean, sir? Waiter, said Drummel, by way of answering me. The waiter reappeared. Look here, you sir. You quite understand that the young lady don't ride today, and that I dine at the young lady's. Quite so, sir. When the waiter had felt my fast cooling teapot with the palm of his hand, and had looked imploringly at me, and had gone out, Drummel, careful not to move the shoulder next me, took a cigar from his pocket, and bit the end off, but showed no sign of stirring. Choking and boiling as I was, I felt that we could not go a word further without introducing Estella's name, which I could not endure to hear him utter, and therefore I looked stonily at the opposite wall, as if there were no one present, and forced myself to silence. How long we may have remained in this ridiculous position it is impossible to say, but for the incursion of 3 thriving farmers, laid on by the waiter, I think, who came into the coffee-room unbuttoning their greatcoats and rubbing their hands, and before whom, as they charged at the fire, we were obliged to give way. I saw him through the window, seizing his horse's mane, and mounting in his blundering, brutal manner, and sidling and backing away. I thought he was gone, when he came back, calling for a light for the cigar in his mouth, which he had forgotten. A man in a dust-colored dress appeared, with what was wanted. I could not have said from where, whether from the inn-yard or the street, or where not, and as Drummel leaned down from the saddle and lighted his cigar and laughed, with a jerk of his head towards the coffee-room windows, the slouching shoulders and ragged hair of this man whose back was towards me reminded me of Orlick. Chapter Roman 44. In the room where the dressing table stood, and where the wax candles burnt on the wall, I found Miss Havisham and Estella. Miss Havisham seated on a settee near the fire, and Estella on a cushion at her feet. Estella was knitting, and Miss Havisham was looking on. They both raised their eyes as I went in, and both saw an alteration in me. I derived that from the look they interchanged. And what wind, said Miss Havisham, blows you here, Pip? Though she looked steadily at me, I saw that she was rather confused. Estella, pausing a moment in her knitting with her eyes upon me, and then going on, I fancied that I read in the action of her fingers, as plainly as if she had told me in the dumb alphabet, that she perceived I had discovered my real benefactor. Miss Havisham, said I went to Richmond yesterday to speak to Estella, and finding that some wind had blown her here, I followed. Miss Havisham motioning to me for the 3rd or 4th time to sit down, I took the chair by the dressing table, which I had often seen her occupy. With all that ruin at my feet and about me, it seemed a natural place for me that day. what I had to say to Estella, Miss Havisham, I will say before you, soon, in a few moments. It will not surprise you, it will not displease you. I am as unhappy as you can ever have meant me to be. Miss Havisham continued to look steadily at me. I could see in the action of Estella's fingers as they worked that she attended to what I said, but she did not look up. I have found out who my patron is. It is not a fortunate discovery, and is not likely ever to enrich me in reputation, station, fortune, anything. There are reasons why I must say no more of that. It is not my secret, but another's. As I was silent for a while, looking at Estella and considering how to go on, Miss Havisham repeated, "It is not your secret, but another's." Well, when you first caused me to be brought here, Miss Havisham, when I belonged to the village over there, that I wish I had never left, I suppose I did really come here as any other chance boy may have come, as a kind of servant, to gratify a want or a whim, and to be paid for it. "I, Pip," replied Miss Havisham, steadily nodding her head, "you did. And that Mr. Jaggers," said Miss Havisham, taking me up in a firm tone, "had nothing to do with it and knew nothing of it. His being my lawyer, and his being the lawyer of your patron, is a coincidence. He holds the same relation towards numbers of people, and it may easily arise. Be that as it may, it did arise and was not brought about by any one. Any one may have seen in her haggard face that there was no suppression or evasion so far, but when I fell into the mistake I have so long remained in, at least, you led me on?" said I. "Yes," she returned, again nodding steadily. "I let you go on. Was that kind?" "Who am I?" cried Miss Havisham, striking her stick upon the floor, and flashing into wrath so suddenly that Estella glanced up at her in surprise. "Who am I, for God's sake, that I should be kind?" It was a weak complaint to have made, and I had not meant to make it. I told her so as she sat brooding after this outburst. Well, she said. "What else?" "I was liberally paid for my old attendance here," I said, to soothe her, "in being apprenticed, and I have asked these questions only for my own information. What follows has another, and I hope more disinterested purpose. In humoring my mistake, Miss Havisham, you practiced on. Perhaps you will supply whatever term expresses your intention without offense. Your self-seeking relations?" I did. "Why, they would have it so. So would you. What has been my history, that I should be at the pains of entreating either them or you not to have it so? You made your own snares. I never made them." Waiting until she was quiet again, for this, too, flashed out of her in a wild and sudden way, I went on. "I have been thrown among one family of your relations, Miss Havisham, and have been constantly among them since I went to London. I know them to have been as honestly under my delusion as I myself, and I should be false and base if I did not tell you whether it is acceptable to you or no, and whether you are inclined to give credence to it or no, that you deeply wrong both Mr. Matthew Pocket and his son Herbert, if you suppose them to be otherwise than generous, upright, open, and incapable of anything designing or mean." "They are your friends," said Miss Havisham. "They made themselves my friends," said I, "when they supposed me to have superseded them, and when Sarah Pocket, Miss Georgiana, and Mistress Camilla were not my friends. I think this contrasting of them with the rest seemed, I was glad to see, to do them good with her." She looked at me keenly for a little while, and then said quietly, "What do you want for them?" "Only," said I, "that you would not confound them with the others. They may be of the same blood, but, believe me, they are not of the same nature." Still looking at me keenly, Miss Havisham repeated, "What do you want for them?" "I am not so cunning, you see," I said in answer, conscious that I reddened a little, as that I could hide from you, evening if I desired, that I do want something. Miss Havisham, if you would spare the money to do my friend Herbert a lasting service in life, but which from the nature of the case must be done without his knowledge. I could show you how. Why must it be done without his knowledge? She asked, settling her hands upon her stick, that she may regard me the more attentively. Because, said I began the service myself more than 2 years ago without his knowledge, and I don't want to be betrayed. Why I fail in my ability to finish it, I cannot explain. It is a part of the secret which is another person's and not mine. She gradually withdrew her eyes from me and turned them on the fire. After watching it for what appeared in the silence and by the light of the slowly wasting candles to be a long time, she was roused by the collapse of some of the red coals and looked towards me again, at first vacantly, then with a gradually concentrating attention. All this time Estella knitted on. When Miss Havisham had fixed her attention on me, she said, speaking as if there had been no lapse in our dialogue. What else? Estella, said I, turning to her now, and trying to command my trembling voice, you know I love you. You know that I have loved you long and dearly. She raised her eyes to my face on being thus addressed, and her fingers plied their work, and she looked at me with an unmoved countenance. I saw that Miss Havisham glanced from me to her, and from her to me. I should have said this sooner, but for my long mistake. It induced me to hope that Miss Havisham meant us for one another. While I thought you could not help yourself, as it were, I refrained from saying it. But I must say it now, preserving her unmoved countenance, and with her fingers still going. Estella shook her head. I know, said I, in answer to that action, I know. I have no hope that I shall ever call you mine, Estella. I am ignorant what may become of me very soon, how poor I may be, or where I may go. Still, I love you. I have loved you ever since I first saw you in this house. Looking at me perfectly unmoved, and with her fingers busy, she shook her head again. It would have been cruel in Miss Havisham, horribly cruel, to practice on the susceptibility of a poor boy, and to torture me through all these years with a vain hope and an idle pursuit, if she had reflected on the gravity of what she did. But I think she did not. I think that, in the endurance of her own trial, she forgot mine. Estella, I saw Miss Havisham put her hand to her heart and hold it there, as she sat looking by turns at Estella and at me. It seems, said Estella, very calmly, that there are sentiments, fancies, I don't know how to call them, which I am not able to comprehend. When you say you love me, I know what you mean, as a form of words, but nothing more. You address nothing in my breast, you touch nothing there. I don't care for what you say at all. I have tried to warn you of this, now have I not? I said in a miserable manner, yes, yes, but you would not be warned, for you thought I did not mean it. Now, did you not think so? I thought and hoped you could not mean it. You, so young, and trite, and beautiful, Estella. Surely it is not in nature. It is in my nature, she returned. And then she added, with a stress upon the words, it is in the nature formed within me. I make a great difference between you and all other people when I say so much. I can do no more. Is it not true, said I, that Bentley Drummle is in town here and pursuing you? It is quite true, she replied, referring to him with the indifference of utter contempt, that you encourage him, and ride out with him, and that he dines with you this very day? She seemed a little surprised that I should know it, but again replied, quite true. You cannot love him, Estella. Her fingers stopped for the first time, as she retorted rather angrily, what have I told you? Do you still think, in spite of it, that I do not mean what I say? You would never marry him, Estella? She looked towards Miss Havisham, and considered for a moment with her work in her hands. Then she said, why not tell you the truth? I am going to be married to him. I dropped my face into my hands, but was able to control myself better than I could have expected, considering what agony it gave me to hear her say those words. When I raised my face again, there was such a ghastly look upon Miss Havisham's that it impressed me, evening in my passionate hurry and grief. Estella, dearest Estella, do not let Miss Havisham lead you into this fatal step. Put me aside forever. You have done so, I well know, but bestow yourself on some worthier person than Drummle. Miss Havisham gives you to him as the greatest slight and injury that could be done to the many far better men who admire you, and to the few who truly love you. Among those few there may be one who loves you even as dearly, though he has not loved you as long as I. Take him, and I can bear it better for your sake. My earnestness awoke a wonder in her that seemed as if it would have been touched with compassion if she could have rendered me at all intelligible to her own mind. I am going, she said again, in a gentler voice, to be married to him. The preparations for my marriage are making, and I shall be married soon. Why do you injuriously introduce the name of my mother by adoption? It is my own act, your own act, Estella, to fling yourself away upon a brute. On whom should I fling myself away? She retorted, with a smile. Should I fling myself away upon the man who would the soonest feel if people do feel such things that I took nothing to him? There, it is done. I shall do well enough, and so will my husband. As to leading me into what you call this fatal step, Miss Havisham would have had me wait and not marry yet, but I am tired of the life I have led, which has very few charms for me, and I am willing enough to change it. Say no, Mar, we shall never understand each other. Such a mean brute, such a stupid brute, I urged, in despair. Don't be afraid of my being a blessing to him, said Estella. I shall not be that. Come, here is my hand. Do we part on this, you visionary boy or man? Oh, Estella, I answered, as my bitter tears fell fast on her hand, do what I would to restrain them, evening if I remained in England and could hold my head up with the rest. How could I see you Drummle's wife? Nonsense, she returned, nonsense. This will pass in no time. Never, Estella. You will get me out of your thoughts in a week. Out of my thoughts. You are part of my existence, part of myself. You have been in every line I have ever read since I first came here, the rough common boy whose poor heart you wounded evening then. You have been in every prospect I have ever seen since, on the river, on the sails of the ships, on the marshes, in the clouds, in the light, in the darkness, in the wind, in the woods, in the sea, in the streets. You have been the embodiment of every graceful fancy that my mind has ever become acquainted with. The stones of which the strongest London buildings are made are not more real or more impossible to be displaced by your hands than your presence and influence have been to me, there and everywhere, and will be, Estella, to the last hour of my life. You cannot choose but remain part of my character, part of the little good in me, part of the evil, but in this separation I associate you only with the good, and I will faithfully hold you to that always, for you must have done me far more good than harm. Let me feel now what sharp distress I may. Oh, God bless you, God forgive you. In what ecstasy of unhappiness I got these broken words out of myself, I don't know. The rhapsody welled up within me like blood from an inward wound and gushed out. I held her hand to my lips some lingering moments, and so I left her. But ever afterwards I remembered, and soon afterwards with stronger reason, that while Estella looked at me merely with incredulous wonder, the spectral figure of Miss Havisham, her hand still covering her heart, seemed all resolved into a ghastly stare of pity and remorse. All done, all gone, so much was done and gone, that when I went out at the gate, the light of the day seemed of a darker color than when I went in. For a while, I hid myself among some lanes and bypaths, and then struck off to walk all the way to London, for I had by that time come to myself so far as to consider that I could not go back to the inn and see Drummle there. that I could not bear to sit upon the coach, and be spoken to, that I could do nothing half so good for myself as tire myself out. It was past midnight when I crossed London Bridge, pursuing the narrow intricacies of the streets which at that time tended westward near the Middlesex shore of the river. My readiest access to the Temple was close by the river side, through Whitefriars. I was not expected till to-morrow, but I had my keys, and if Herbert were gone to bed, could get to bed myself without disturbing him. As it seldom happened that I came in at that Whitefriars gate after the Temple was closed, and as I was very muddy and weary, I did not take it ill that the night boarder examined me with much attention as he held the gate a little way open for me to pass in. To help his memory, I mentioned my name. I was not quite sure, sir, but I thought so. Here's a note, sir. The messenger that brought it said would you be so good as read it by my lantern? Much surprised by the request, I took the note,